አድማጮቻችን ቡክ 3 ማለት ካርል ቫንስ ሶስተኛው ኤዲሽን አሁን ይቀጥላል። ከሁለተኛው volume 1 book 3 አሁን ይቀጥላል።
Book 3, chapters 1 through 5 of On War. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. On War by Karl von Clausewitz, translated by Colonel J.J. Graham. Book 3 of Strategy in General, Chapter 1, Strategy. In the second chapter of the second book, strategy has been defined as the employment of the battle as the means towards the attainment of the object of the war. Properly speaking, it has to do with nothing but the battle, but its theory must include in this consideration the instrument of this real activity, the armed force, in itself and in its principal relations, for the battle is fought by it, and shows its effects upon it in turn. It must be well acquainted with the battle itself, as far as relates to its possible results, and those mental and moral powers which are the most important in the use of the same. Strategy is the employment of the battle to gain the end of the war. It must therefore give an aim to the whole military action, which must be in accordance with the object of the war. In other words, strategy forms the plan of the war, and to this end it links together the series of acts which are to lead to the final decision. That is to say, it makes the plans for the separate campaigns and regulates the combats to be fought in each. As these are all things which to a great extent can only be determined on conjectures, some of which turn out to be incorrect, while a number of other arrangements pertaining to details cannot be made at all beforehand, it follows as a matter of course that strategy must go with the army to the field in order to arrange particulars on the spot, and to make modifications in the general plan, which incessantly become necessary in war. Strategy can, therefore, never take its hand from the work for a moment. That this, however, has not always been the view taken is evident from the former custom of keeping strategy in the cabinet, and not with the army, a thing only allowable if the cabinet is so near to the army that it can be taken for the chief headquarters of the army. Theory will therefore attend on strategy in the determination of its plans, or, as we may more properly say, it will throw a light on things in themselves, and on their relations to each other, and bring out prominently the little that there is of principle or rule. If we recall to mind from the first chapter how many things of the highest importance war touches upon, we may conceive that a consideration of all requires a rare grasp of mind. A prince or general who knows exactly how to organize his war according to his object and means, who does neither too little nor too much, gives by that the greatest proof of his genius. But the effects of this talent are exhibited not so much by the invention of new modes of action, which might strike the eye immediately, as in the successful final result of the whole. It is the exact fulfillment of silent suppositions, it is the noiseless harmony of the whole action which we should admire, and which only makes itself known in the total result. Inquirer who, tracing back from the final result, does not perceive the signs of that harmony, is one who is apt to seek for genius where it is not, and where it cannot be found. The means and forms which strategy uses are in fact so extremely simple, so well known by their constant repetition, that it only appears ridiculous to sound common sense when it hears critics so frequently speaking of them with high-flown emphasis. Turning a flank, which has been done 1,000 times, is regarded here as a proof of the most brilliant genius, there as a proof of the most profound penetration, indeed even of the most comprehensive knowledge. Can there be in the book world more absurd productions? It is still more ridiculous if, in addition to this, we reflect that the same critic, in accordance with prevalent opinion, excludes all moral forces from theory, and will not allow it to be concerned with anything but the material forces, so that all must be confined to a few mathematical relations of equilibrium and preponderance, of time and space, and a few lines and angles. If it were nothing more than this, then out of such a miserable business there would not be a scientific problem for even a schoolboy. But let us admit, there is no question here about scientific formulas and problems. The relations of material things are all very simple. The right comprehension of the moral forces which come into play is more difficult. Still, even in respect to them, it is only in the highest branches of strategy that moral complications and a great diversity of qualities and relations are to be looked for, only at that point where strategy borders on political science, or rather, where the two become one, and there, as we have before observed, they have more influence on the how much and how little is to be done than on the form of execution. Where the latter is the principal question, as in the single acts, both great and small in war, the moral quantities are already reduced to a very small number. Thus then, in strategy, everything is very simple, but not on that account very easy. Once it is determined from the relations of the state what should and may be done by war, then the way to it is easy to find. But to follow that way straightforward, to carry out the plan without being obliged to deviate from it 1,000 times by 1,000 varying influences, requires, besides great strength of character, great clearness and steadiness of mind. And out of 1,000 men who are remarkable, some for mind, others for penetration, others again for boldness or strength of will, perhaps not one will combine in himself all those qualities which are required to raise a man above mediocrity in the career of a general. It may sound strange, but for all who know war in this respect, it is a fact beyond doubt that much more strength of will is required to make an important decision in strategy than in tactics. In the latter, we are hurried on with the moment. A commander feels himself borne along in a strong current, against which he durst not contend without the most destructive consequences. He suppresses the rising fears, and boldly ventures further. In strategy, where all goes on at a slower rate, there is more room allowed for our own apprehensions and those of others, for objections and remonstrances, consequently also for unreasonable regrets. And as we do not see things in strategy, as we do at least half of them in tactics with the living eye, but everything must be conjectured and assumed, the convictions produced are less powerful. The consequence is that most generals, when they should act, remain stuck fast in bewildering doubts. Now let us cast a glance at history upon Frederick the Great's campaign of 1760, celebrated for its fine marches and manoeuvres, a perfect masterpiece of strategic skill, as critics tell us. Is there really anything to drive us out of our wits with admiration in the king's first trying to turn Daun's right flank, then his left, then again his right, and such? Are we to see profound wisdom in this? No, that we cannot, if we are to decide naturally and without affectation. What we rather admire above all is the sagacity of the king in this respect, that while pursuing a great object with very limited means, he undertook nothing beyond his powers, and just enough to gain his object. This sagacity of the general is visible not only in this campaign, but throughout all the 3 wars of the great king. To bring Silesia into the safe harbour of a well-guaranteed peace was his object. At the head of a small state, which was like other states in most things, and only ahead of them in some branches of administration, he could not be an Alexander, and, as Charles XII, he would only, like him, have broken his head. We find, therefore, in the whole of his conduct of war, a controlled power, always well balanced, and never wanting in energy, which in the most critical moments rises to astonishing deeds, and the next moment oscillates quietly on again in subordination to the play of the most subtle political influences. Neither vanity, thirst for glory, nor vengeance could make him deviate from his course, and this course alone it is which brought him to a fortunate termination of the contest. These few words do but scant justice to this phase of the genius of the great general. The eyes must be fixed carefully on the extraordinary issue of the struggle, and the causes which brought about that issue must be traced out, in order thoroughly to understand that nothing but the king's penetrating eye brought him safely out of all dangers. This is one feature in this great commander which we admire in the campaign of 1760, and in all others, but in this especially, because in none did he keep the balance even against such a superior hostile force with such a small sacrifice. Another feature relates to the difficulty of execution. Marches to turn a flank, right or left, are easily combined. The idea of keeping a small force always well concentrated to be able to meet the enemy on equal terms at any point, To multiply a force by rapid movement is as easily conceived as expressed. The mere contrivance in these points, therefore, cannot excite our admiration, and with respect to such things, there is nothing further than to admit that they are simple. But let a general try to do these things like Frederick the Great. Long afterwards, authors who were eyewitnesses have spoken of the danger, indeed of the imprudence of the king's camps, and doubtless at the time he pitched them, the danger appeared 3 times as great as afterwards. It was the same with his marches. Under the eyes, nay, often under the cannon of the enemy's army, these camps were taken up, these marches made, not from want of prudence, but because in Downe's system, in his mode of drawing up his army, in the responsibility which pressed upon him, and in his character, Frederick found that security which justified his camps and marches. But it required the king's boldness, determination, and strength of will to see things in this light, and not to be led astray and intimidated by the danger, of which 30 years after people still wrote and spoke. Few generals in this situation would have believed these simple strategic means to be practicable. Another difficulty in execution lay in this, that the king's army in this campaign was constantly in motion. Twice it marched by wretched crossroads, from the Elbe to Silesia, in rear of Daun, and pursued by Lasky, beginning of July, beginning of August. It required to be always ready for battle, and its marches had to be organised with a degree of skill which necessarily called forth a proportionate amount of exertion. Although attended and delayed by thousands of wagons, still its subsistence was extremely difficult. In Silesia, for 8 days before the Battle of Liegnitz, it had constantly to march, defiling alternately right and left in front of the enemy. This costs great fatigue, and entails great privations. Is it to be supposed that all of this could have been done without producing great friction in the machine? Can the mind of a great commander elaborate such movements with the same ease as the hand of a land surveyor uses the astrolabe? Does not the sight of the sufferings of their hungry, thirsty comrades pierce the hearts of the commander and his generals 1,000 times? Must not the murmurs and doubts which these cause reach his ear? Has an ordinary man the courage to demand such sacrifices, and would not such efforts most certainly demoralize the army, break up the bands of discipline, and, in short, undermine its military virtue, if firm reliance on the greatness and infallibility of the commander did not compensate for all? Here, therefore, it is that we should pay respect. It is these miracles of execution which we should admire. But it is impossible to realize all this in its full force, without a foretaste of it by experience. He who only knows war from books, or the drill ground, cannot realize the whole effect of this counterpoise in action. We beg him, therefore, to accept from us, on faith, and trust all that he is unable to supply from any personal experiences of his own. This illustration is intended to give more clearness to the course of our ideas, and in closing this chapter, we will only briefly observe that in our exposition of strategy, we shall describe those separate subjects which appear to us the most important, whether of a moral or material nature, then proceed from the simple to the complex, and conclude with the inner connection of the whole act of war, in other words, with the plan for a war or campaign. Observation. In an earlier manuscript of the first book are the following pages, endorsed by the author himself to be used for the first chapter of the second book. The projected revision of that chapter not having been made, the passages referred to are introduced here in full. By the mere assemblage of armed forces at a particular point, a battle there becomes possible, but does not always take place. Is that possibility now to be regarded as a reality, and therefore an effective thing? Certainly it is so by its results, and these effects, whatever they may be, can never fail. 1. Possible combats are, on account of their results, to be looked upon as real ones. If a detachment is sent away to cut off the retreat of a flying enemy, and the enemy surrenders in consequence without further resistance, still it is through the combat which is offered to him by this detachment sent after him that he is brought to his decision. If part of our army occupies an enemy's province, which was undefended, and thus deprives the enemy of very considerable means of keeping up the strength of his army, it is entirely through the battle which our detached body gives the enemy to expect, in case he seeks to recover the lost province, that we remain in possession of the same. In both cases, therefore, the mere possibility of a battle has produced results, and it is therefore to be classed amongst actual events. Suppose that in these cases the enemy has opposed our troops with others superior in force, and thus forced ours to give up their object without a combat, then certainly our plan has failed. But the battle which we offered at either of those points has not on that account been without effect, for it attracted the enemy's forces to that point, and in case our whole undertaking has done us harm, it cannot be said that these positions, these possible battles, have been attended with no results. Their effects, then, are similar to those of a lost battle. In this manner we may see that the destruction of the enemy's military forces, the overthrow of the enemy's power, is only to be done through the effect of battle, whether it be that it actually takes place, or that it is merely offered and not accepted. 2. Twofold object of the combat. But these effects are of two kinds, direct and indirect. They are of the latter if other things intrude themselves and become the object of the combat, things which cannot be regarded as the destruction of the enemy's force, but only leading up to it, certainly by a circuitous road, but with so much the greater effect. The possession of provinces, towns, fortresses, roads, bridges, magazines, and such, may be the immediate object of a battle, but never the ultimate one. Things of this description can never be looked upon as otherwise than a means of gaining greater superiority, so as, at last, to offer battle to the enemy in such a way that it will be impossible for him to accept it. Therefore, all these things must only be regarded as intermediate links, steps, as it were, leading up to the effectual principle, but never as the principle itself. 3. Example. In 1814, by the capture of Bonaparte's capital, the object of the war was attained. The political divisions which had their roots in Paris came into active operation, and an enormous split left the power of the emperor to collapse of itself. Nevertheless, the point of view from which we must look at all this, that through these causes the forces and defensive means of Bonaparte were suddenly and very much diminished, the superiority of the Allies therefore just in the same measure increased, and any further resistance then became impossible. It was this impossibility which produced the peace with France. If we suppose the forces of the Allies at that moment diminished to a like extent through external causes, if the superiority vanishes, then at the same time vanishes also all the effect and importance of the taking of Paris. We have gone through this chain of argument in order to show that this is the natural and only true view of the thing from which it derives its importance. It leads always back to the question, what at any given moment of the war or campaign will be the probable result of the great or small combats which the two sides might offer to each other. In the consideration of a plan for a campaign, this question only is decisive as to the measures which are to be taken all through from the very commencement. 4. When this view is not taken, then a false value is given to other things. If we do not accustom ourselves to look upon war, and the single campaigns in a war, as a chain which is all composed of battles strung together, one of which always brings on another, if we adopt the idea that the taking of a certain geographical point, the occupation of an undefended province, is in itself anything, then we are very likely to regard it as an acquisition which we may retain, and if we look at it so, and not as a term in the whole series of events, we do not ask ourselves whether this possession may not lead to greater disadvantages hereafter. How often we find this mistake recurring in military history. We might say that, just as in commerce, the merchant cannot set apart and place in security gains from one single transaction by itself, so in war a single advantage cannot be separated from the result of the whole. Just as the former must always operate with the whole bulk of his means, just so in war, only the sum total will decide on the advantage or disadvantage of each item. If the mind's eye is always directed upon the series of combats, so far as they can be seen beforehand, then it is always looking in the right direction, and thereby the motion of the force acquires that rapidity. That is to say, willing and doing acquire that energy which is suitable to the matter, and which is not to be thwarted or turned aside by extraneous influences. Chapter 2, Elements of Strategy. The causes which condition the use of the combat in strategy may be easily divided into elements of different kinds, such as the moral, physical, mathematical, geographical, and statistical elements. The first class includes all that can be called forth by moral qualities and effects. To the second belong the whole mass of the military force, its organisation, the proportion of the three arms, and such, and such. To the third, the angle of the lines of operation, the concentric and eccentric movements, in as far as their geometrical nature has any value in the calculation. To the fourth, the influences of country, such as commanding points, hills, rivers, woods, roads, and such, and such. Lastly, to the fifth, all the means of supply. The separation of these things once for all in the mind does good in giving clearness and helping to estimate at once, at a higher or lower value, the different classes as we pass onwards. For in considering them separately, many lose of themselves their borrowed importance. One feels, for instance, quite plainly that the value of a base of operations, even if we look at nothing in it but its relative position to the line of operations, depends much less in that simple form on the geometrical element of the angle which they form with one another than on the nature of the roads and the country through which they pass. But to treat strategy according to these elements would be the most unfortunate idea that could be conceived, for these elements are generally manifold and intimately connected with each other in every single operation of war. We should lose ourselves in the most soulless analysis, and, as if in a horrid dream, we should be forever trying in vain to build up an arch to connect this base of abstractions with facts belonging to the real world. Heaven preserve every theorist from such an undertaking. We shall keep to the world of things in their totality, and do not pursue our analysis further than is necessary from time to time to give distinctness to the idea which we wish to impart, and which has come to us not by a speculative investigation, but through the impression made by the realities of war in their entirety. Chapter 3. Moral Forces. We must return again to this subject, which is touched upon in the third chapter of the second book, because moral forces are amongst the most important subjects in war. They form the spirit which permeates the whole being of war. These forces fasten themselves soonest and with the greatest affinity onto the will which puts in motion and guides the whole mass of powers, uniting with it, as it were in one stream, because this is a moral force itself. Unfortunately, they will escape from all book analysis, for they will neither be brought into numbers nor into classes, and require to be both seen and felt. The spirit and other moral qualities which animate an army, a general, or governments, public opinion in provinces in which war is raging, the moral effect of a victory or a defeat, are things which in themselves vary very much in their nature, and which also, according as they stand with regard to our object and our relations, may have an influence in different ways. Although little or nothing can be said about these things in books, still they belong to the theory of the art of war as much as everything else which constitutes war. For I must here once more repeat that it is a miserable philosophy if, according to the old plan, we establish rules and principles wholly regardless of all moral forces, and then, as soon as these forces make their appearance, we begin to count exceptions, which we begin to establish as it were theoretically, that is, make into rules, or if we resort to an appeal to genius, which is above all rules, thus giving out by implication not only that rules were only made for fools, but also that they themselves are no better than folly. Even if the theory of the art of war does no more in reality than recall these things to remembrance, showing the necessity of allowing to the moral forces their full value, and of always taking them into consideration, by doing so it extends its borders over the region of immaterial forces, and by establishing that point of view, condemns beforehand every one who would endeavour to justify himself before its judgment seat by the mere physical relations of forces. Further, out of regard to all other so-called rules, theory cannot banish the moral forces beyond its frontier, because the effects of the physical forces and the moral are completely fused, and are not to be decomposed like a metal alloy by a chemical process. In every rule relating to the physical forces, theory must present to the mind at the same time the share which the moral powers will have in it. If it would not be led to categorical propositions, at one time too timid and contracted, at another too dogmatical and wide, even the most matter-of-fact theories have, without knowing it, strayed over into this moral kingdom, for, as an example, the effects of a victory cannot in any way be explained without taking into consideration the moral impressions. And therefore the most of the subjects, which we shall go through in this book, are composed half of physical, half of moral causes and effects, and we may say the physical are almost no more than the wooden handle, whilst the moral are the noble metal, the real bright polished weapon. The value of the moral powers and their frequently incredible influence are best exemplified by history, and this is the most generous and purest nourishment which the mind of the general can extract from it. At the same time it is to be observed that it is less by demonstrations, critical examinations, and learned treatises, than sentiments, general impressions, and single flashing sparks of truth, which yield the seeds of knowledge that are to fertilize the mind. We might go through the most important moral phenomena in war, and with all the care of a diligent professor try what we could impart about each, either good or bad. But as in such a method one slides too much into the commonplace and trite, whilst real mind quickly makes its escape in analysis, the end is that one gets imperceptibly to the relation of things which everybody knows. We prefer, therefore, to remain here more than usually incomplete and rhapsodical, content to have drawn attention to the importance of the subject in a general way, and to have pointed out the spirit in which the views given in this book have been conceived. Chapter 4. The Chief Moral Powers. These are the talents of the commander, the military virtue of the army, its national feeling. Which of these is the most important, no one can tell in a general way, for it is very difficult to say anything in general of their strength, and still more difficult to compare the strength of one with that of another. The best plan is not to undervalue any of them, a fault which human judgment is prone to, sometimes on one side, sometimes on another, in its whimsical oscillations. It is better to satisfy ourselves of the undeniable efficacy of these three things by sufficient evidence from history. It is true, however, that in modern times the armies of European states have arrived very much at a par as regards to discipline and fitness for service, and that the conduct of war has, as philosophers would say, naturally developed itself, thereby becoming a method common as it were to all armies, so that even from commanders there is nothing further to be expected in the way of application of special means of art in the limited sense, such as Frederick II's oblique order. Hence it cannot be denied that, as matters now stand, greater scope is afforded for the influence of national spirit and habituation of an army to war. A long peace may again alter all this. The national spirit of an army, enthusiasm, fanatical zeal, faith, opinion, displays itself most in mountain warfare, where everyone down to the common soldier is left to himself. On this account a mountainous country is the best campaigning ground for popular levies. Expertness of an army through training, and that well-tempered courage which holds the ranks together as if they had been cast in a mould, show their superiority in an open country. The talent of a general has most room to display itself in a closely intersected, undulating country. In mountains he has too little command over the separate parts, and the direction of all is beyond his powers. In open plains it is simple and does not exceed those powers. According to these undeniable elective affinities, plans should be regulated. Chapter 5. Military virtue of an army. This is distinguished from mere bravery, and still more from enthusiasm for the business of war. The first is certainly a necessary, constituent part of it, but in the same way as bravery, which is a natural gift in some men, may arise in a soldier as part of an army from habit and custom, so with him it must also have a different direction from that which it has with others. It must lose that impulse to unbridled activity and exercise of force, which is its characteristic in the individual, and submit itself to the demands of a higher kind, to obedience, order, rule, and method. Enthusiasm for the profession gives life and greater fire to the military virtue of an army, but does not necessarily constitute a part of it. War is a special business, and however general its relations may be, and even if all the male population of a country capable of bearing arms exercise this calling, still it always continues to be different and separate from the other pursuits which occupy the life of a man. To be imbued with a sense of the spirit and nature of this business, to make use of, to rouse, to assimilate into the system the powers which should be active in it, to penetrate completely into the nature of the business with the understanding, through exercise to gain confidence and expertness in it, to be completely given up to it, to pass out of the man into the part which is assigned to us to play in war, that is the military virtue of an army in the individual. However much pains may be taken to combine the soldier and the citizen in one and the same individual, whatever may be done to nationalize wars, and however much we may imagine times have changed since the days of the old condottieri, never will it be possible to do away with the individuality of the business, and if that cannot be done, then those who belong to it, as long as they belong to it, will always look upon themselves as a kind of guild, in the regulations, laws, and customs in which the spirit of war by preference finds its expression. And so it is in fact. Even with the most decided inclination to look at war from the highest point of view, it would be very wrong to look down upon this corporate spirit, esprit de corps, which may and should exist more or less in every army. This corporate spirit forms the bond of union between the natural forces which are active in that which we have called military virtue. The crystals of military virtue have a greater affinity to the spirit of a corporate body than for anything else. An army which preserves its usual formations under the heaviest fire, which is never shaken by imaginary fears, and in the face of real danger disputes the ground inch by inch, which, proud in the feeling of its victories, never loses its sense of obedience, its respect for and confidence in its leaders, even under the depressing effects of defeat, an army with all its physical powers inured to privations and fatigue by exercise, like the muscles of an athlete, an army which looks upon all its toils as the means to victory, not as a curse which hovers over its standards, and which is always reminded of its duties and virtues by the short catechism of one idea, namely, the honour of its arms, such an army is imbued with the true military spirit. Soldiers may fight bravely, like Vendeans, and do great things like the Swiss, the Americans, or Spaniards, without displaying this military virtue. A commander may also be successful at the head of standing armies, like Eugene and Marlborough, without enjoying the benefit of its assistance. We must not therefore say that a successful war without it cannot be imagined, and we draw special attention to that point in order the more to individualize the conception which is here brought forward, that the idea may not dissolve into a generalization, and that it may not be thought that military virtue is, in the end, everything. It is not so. Military virtue in an army is a definite moral power, which may be supposed wanting, and the influence of which may therefore be estimated, like any instrument the power of which may be calculated. Having thus characterized it, we proceed to consider what can be predicated of its influence, and what are the means of gaining its assistance. Military virtue is for the parts what the genius of the commander is for the whole. The general can only guide the whole, not each separate part, and where he cannot guide the part, there military virtue must be its leader. A general is chosen by the reputation of his superior talents, the chief leaders of large masses after careful probation, but this probation diminishes as we descend the scale of rank, and in just the same measure we may reckon less and less upon individual talents. But what is wanting in this respect, military virtue should supply. The natural qualities of a warlike people play just this part: bravery, aptitude, powers of endurance, and enthusiasm. These properties may therefore supply the place of military virtue, and vice versa, from which the following may be deduced. 1. Military virtue is a quality of standing armies only, but they require it the most. In national risings its place is supplied by natural qualities, which develop themselves more rapidly. 2. Standing armies opposed to standing armies can more easily dispense with it than a standing army opposed to a national insurrection, for in that case the troops are more scattered and the divisions left more to themselves. But where an army can be concentrated, the genius of the general takes a greater place, and supplies what is wanting in the spirit of the army. Therefore, generally, military virtue becomes more necessary the more the theatre of operations and other circumstances make the war complicated, and cause the forces to be scattered. From these truths, the only lesson to be derived is this, that if an army is deficient in this quality, every endeavour should be made to simplify the operations of the war as much as possible, or to introduce double efficiency in the organisation of the army in some other respect, and not to expect, from the mere name of a standing army, that which only the veritable thing itself can give. The military virtue of an army is, therefore, one of the most important moral powers in war, and where it is wanting, we either see its place supplied by one of the others, such as the great superiority of generalship or popular enthusiasm, or we find the results not commensurate with the exertions made. How much that is great, this spirit, this sterling worth of an army, this refining of ore into polished metal, has already done, we see in the history of the Macedonians under Alexander, the Roman legions under Caesar, the Spanish infantry under Alexander Farnese, the Swedes under Gustavus Adolphus and Charles II, the Prussians under Frederick the Great, and the French under Bonaparte. We must purposely shut our eyes against all historical proof if we do not admit that the astonishing successes of these generals and their greatness in situations of extreme difficulty were only possible with armies possessing this virtue. This spirit can only be granted from two sources, and only by these two conjointly. The first is a succession of campaigns and great victories. The other is an activity of the army carried sometimes to the highest pitch. Only by these does the soldier learn to know his powers. The more a general is in the habit of demanding from his troops, the surer he will be that his demands will be answered. The soldier is as proud of overcoming toil as he is of surmounting danger. Therefore it is only in the soil of incessant activity and exertion that the germ will thrive, but also only in the sunshine of victory. Once it becomes a strong tree, it will stand against the fiercest storms of misfortune and defeat, and even against the indolent activity of peace, at least for a time. It can therefore only be created in war and under great generals, but no doubt it may last at least for several generations, even under generals of moderate capacity, and through considerable periods of peace. With this generous and noble spirit of union in a line of veteran troops, covered with scars and thoroughly inured to war, we must not compare the self-esteem and vanity of a standing army, held together merely by the glue of service regulations and a drill book. A certain plodding earnestness and strict discipline may keep up military virtue for a long time, but can never create it. These things, therefore, must have a certain value, but must not be overrated. Order, smartness, goodwill, also a certain degree of pride and high feeling, are qualities of an army formed in time of peace, which are to be prized, but cannot stand alone. The whole retains the whole, and, as with glass too quickly cooled, a single crack breaks the whole mass. Above all, the highest spirit in the world changes only too easily at the first check into depression, and one might say into a kind of rhodomontade of alarm, the French sauve-qui-peut. Such an army can achieve something through its leader, never by itself. It must be led with double caution until, by degrees, in victory and hardships, the strength grows into the full armour. Beware then of confusing the spirit of an army with its temper. End of Book 3, Chapters 1 through 5. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia. Book 3, Chapters 6 through 10 of On War. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. On War by Karl von Clausewitz. Translated by Colonel J. J. Graham. Book 3, Chapter 6. Boldness. The place and part which boldness takes in the dynamic system of powers, where it stands opposed to foresight and prudence, has been stated in the chapter on the certainty of the result, in order thereby to show that theory has no right to restrict it by virtue of its legislative power. But this noble impulse, with which the human soul raises itself above the most formidable dangers, is to be regarded as an active principle peculiarly belonging to war. In fact, in what branch of human activity should boldness have a right of citizenship, if not in war? From the transport driver and the drummer up to the general, it is the noblest of virtues, the true steel which gives the weapon its edge and brilliancy. Let us admit, in fact, it has in war even its own prerogatives. Over and above the results of the calculation of space, time, and quantity, we must allow a certain percentage which boldness derives from the weakness of others, whenever it gains the mastery. It is therefore virtually a creative power. This is not difficult to demonstrate philosophically. As often as boldness encounters hesitation, the probability of the result is, of necessity, in its favour, because the very state of hesitation implies a loss of equilibrium already. It is only when it encounters cautious foresight, which we may say is just as bold, at all events just as strong and powerful as itself, that it is at a disadvantage. Such cases, however, rarely occur. Out of the whole multitude of prudent men in the world, the great majority are so from timidity. Amongst large masses, boldness is a force, the special cultivation of which can never be to the detriment of other forces, because the great mass is bound to a higher will by the framework and joints of the order of battle and of the service, and therefore is guided by an intelligent power which is extraneous. Boldness is therefore here only like a spring held down until action is required. The higher the rank, the more necessary it is that boldness should be accompanied by a reflective mind, that it may not be a mere blind outburst of passion to no purpose. For with increase of rank it becomes always less a matter of self-sacrifice, and more a matter of the preservation of others, and the good of the whole. Where regulations of the service, as a kind of second nature, prescribe for the masses, reflection must be the guide of the general, and in his case individual boldness in action may easily become a fault. Still, at the same time, it is a fine failing, and must not be looked at in the same light as any other. Happy the army in which untimely boldness frequently manifests itself. It is an exuberant growth, which shows a rich soil. Even foolhardiness, that is, boldness without an object, is not to be despised. In point of fact, it is the same energy of feeling, only exercised as a kind of passion without any cooperation of the intelligent faculties. It is only when it strikes at the root of obedience, when it treats with contempt the orders of superior authority, that it must be repressed as a dangerous evil, not on its own account, but on account of the act of disobedience, for there is nothing in war which is of greater importance than obedience. The reader will readily agree with us that, supposing an equal degree of discernment to be forthcoming in a certain number of cases, 1,000 times as many of them will end in disaster through over-anxiety as through boldness. One would suppose it natural that the interposition of a reasonable object should stimulate boldness, and therefore lessen its intrinsic merit, and yet the reverse is the case in reality. The intervention of lucid thought, or the general supremacy of the mind, deprives the emotional forces of the great part of their power. On that account, boldness becomes of rarer occurrence the higher we ascend the scale of rank, for whether the discernment and the understanding do or do not increase with these ranks, still the commanders, in their several stations as they rise, are pressed upon more and more severely by objective things, by relations and claims from without, so that they become the more perplexed the lower the degree of their individual intelligence. This, so far as regards war, is the chief foundation of the truth of the French proverb, tel brille au second que s'éclipse en premier. Almost all the generals who are represented in history as merely having attained to mediocrity, and as wanting in decision when in supreme command, are men celebrated in their antecedent career for their boldness and decision. In those motives to bold action which arise from the pressure of necessity, we must make a distinction. Necessity has its degrees of intensity. If it lies near at hand, if the person acting is in the pursuit of his object, driven into great dangers in order to escape others equally great, then we can only admire his resolution, which still has also its value. If a young man, to show his skill in horsemanship, leaps across a deep cleft, then he is bold. If he makes the same leap, pursued by a troop of head-chopping janissaries, he is only resolute. But the farther off the necessity from the point of action, the greater the number of relations intervening which the mind has to traverse in order to realize them, by so much the less does necessity take from boldness in action. If Frederick the Great, in the year 1756, saw that war was inevitable and that he could only escape destruction by being beforehand with his enemies, it became necessary for him to commence the war himself, but at the same time it was certainly very bold. Few men in his position would have made up their minds to do so. Although strategy is only the province of generals-in-chief or commanders in the higher positions, still boldness in all the other branches of an army is as little a matter of indifference to it as their other military virtues. With an army belonging to a bold race, and in which the spirit of boldness has been always nourished, very different things may be undertaken than with one in which this virtue is unknown. For that reason we have considered it in connection with an army, but our subject is specially the boldness of the general, and yet we have not much to say about it after having described this military virtue in a general way to the best of our ability. The higher we rise in a position of command, the more of the mind, understanding, and penetration predominate in activity, the more, therefore, is boldness, which is a property of the feelings, kept in subjection, and for that reason we find it so rarely in the highest positions. But then, so much the more should it be admired. Boldness, directed by an overruling intelligence, is the stamp of the hero. This boldness does not consist in venturing directly against the nature of things, in a downright contempt of the laws of probability, but, if a choice is once made, in the rigorous adherence to that higher calculation which genius, the tact of judgment, has gone over with the speed of lightning. The more boldness lends wings to the mind and the discernment, so much the further will they reach in their flight, so much the more comprehensive will be the view, the more exact the result, but certainly always only in the sense that with greater objects greater dangers are connected. The ordinary man, not to speak of the weak and irresolute, arrives at an exact result so far as is possible without ocular demonstration, at most after diligent reflection in his chamber, at a distance from danger and responsibility. Let danger and responsibility draw close round him in every direction, then he loses the power of comprehensive vision, and if he retains this in any measure by the influence of others, he will still lose his power of decision, because in that point no one can help him. We think then it impossible to imagine a distinguished general without boldness, that is to say, no man can become one who is not born with this power of the soul, and we therefore look upon it as the first requisite for such a career. How much of this inborn power, developed and moderated through education and the circumstances of life, is left when the man has attained a high position, is the second question. The greater this power still is, the stronger will genius be on the wing, the higher will be its flight. The risks become always greater, but the purpose grows with them. Whether its lines proceed out of and get their direction from a distant necessity, or whether they converge to the keystone of a building which ambition has planned, whether Frederick or Alexander acts, is much the same as regards the critical view. If the one excites the imagination because it is bolder, the other pleases the understanding most, because it has in it more absolute necessity. We have still to advert to one very important circumstance. The spirit of boldness can exist in an army either because it is in the people, or because it has been generated in a successful war conducted by able generals. In the latter case it must of course be dispensed with at the commencement. Now in our days there is hardly any other means of educating the spirit of a people in this respect, except by war, and that too under bold generals. By it alone can the effeminacy of feeling be counteracted, that propensity to seek for the enjoyment of comfort which caused degeneracy in a people, rising in prosperity, and immersed in an extremely busy commerce. A nation can hope to have a strong position in the political world only if its character and practice in actual war mutually support each other in constant reciprocal action. Chapter 7. Perseverance. The reader expects to hear of angles and lines, and finds, instead of these citizens of the scientific world, only people out of common life, such as he meets with every day in the street, and yet the author cannot make up his mind to become a hair's breadth more mathematical than the subject seems to him to require, and he is not alarmed at the surprise which the reader may show. In war, more than anywhere else in the world, things happen differently to what we had expected, and look differently when near to what they did at a distance. With what serenity the architect can watch his work gradually rising and growing into his plan. The doctor, although much more at the mercy of mysterious agencies and chances than the architect, still knows enough of the forms and effects of his means. In war, on the other hand, the commander of an immense whole finds himself in a constant whirlpool of false and true information, of mistakes committed through fear, through negligence, through precipitation, of contraventions of his authority, either from mistaken or correct motives, from ill will, true or false sense of duty, indolence or exhaustion, of accidents which no mortal could have foreseen. In short, he is the victim of 100,000 impressions, of which the most have an intimidating, the fewest an encouraging tendency. By long experience in war, the tact is acquired of readily appreciating the value of these incidents. High courage and stability of character stand proof against them, as the rock resists the beating of the waves. He who would yield to these impressions would never carry out an undertaking, and, on that account, perseverance in the proposed object, as long as there is no decided reason against it, is the most necessary counterpoise. Further, there is hardly any celebrated enterprise in war which was not achieved by endless exertion, pains, and privations, and, as here, the weakness of the physical and moral man is ever disposed to yield. Only an immense force of will, which manifests itself in perseverance, admired by present and future generations, can conduct to our goal. Chapter 8. Superiority of Numbers. This is in tactics, as well as in strategy, the most general principle of victory, and shall be examined by us, first in its generality, for which we may be permitted the following exposition. Strategy fixes the point where, the time when, and the numerical force with which the battle is to be fought. By this triple determination it has therefore a very essential influence on the issue of the combat. If tactics has fought the battle, if the result is over, let it be victory or defeat, strategy makes such use of it as can be made in accordance with the great object of the war. This object is naturally often a very distant one. Seldom does it lie quite close at hand. A series of other objects subordinate themselves to it as means. These objects, which are at the same time means to a higher purpose, may be practically of various kinds. Even the ultimate aim of the whole war may be a different one in every case. We shall make ourselves acquainted with these things according as we come to know the separate objects which they come in contact with, and it is not our intention here to embrace the whole subject by a complete enumeration of them, even if that were possible. We therefore let the employment of the battle stand over for the present. Even those things through which strategy has an influence on the issue of the combat, insomuch as it establishes the same, to a certain extent decrees them, are not so simple that they can be embraced in one single view, for as strategy appoints time, place, and force, it can do so in practice in many ways, each of which influences in a different manner the result of the combat as well as its consequences. Therefore we shall only get acquainted with this also by degrees, that is, through the subjects which more closely determine the application. If we strip the combat of all modifications which it may undergo according to its immediate purpose and the circumstance from which it proceeds, lastly, if we set aside the valour of the troops, because that is a given quantity, then there remains only the bare conception of the combat, that is, a combat without form, in which we distinguish nothing but the number of the combatants. This number will, therefore, determine victory. Now, from the number of things above deducted to get to this point, it is shown that the superiority in numbers in a battle is only one of the factors employed to produce victory, that therefore, so far from having with the superiority in number obtained all, or even only the principal thing, we have perhaps got very little by it, according as the other circumstances which cooperate happen to vary. But this superiority has degrees. It may be imagined as twofold, threefold, or fourfold, and everyone sees that by increasing it this way it must, at last, overpower everything else. In such an aspect we grant that the superiority in numbers is the most important factor in the result of combat, only it must be sufficiently great to be a counterpoise to all the other cooperating circumstances. The direct result of this is that the greatest possible number of troops should be brought into action at the decisive point. Whether the troops thus brought are sufficient or not, we have then done in this respect all that our means allowed. This is the first principle in strategy. Therefore, in general, as now stated, it is just as well suited for Greeks and Persians, or for Englishmen and Marathas, as for French and Germans. But we shall take a glance at our relations in Europe as respects war, in order to arrive at some more definite idea on this subject. Here we find armies very much more alike in equipment, organisation, and practical skill of every kind. There only remains a difference in the military virtues of the armies, and in the talent of the generals, which may fluctuate with time from side to side. If we go through the military history of modern Europe, we find no example of a marathon. Frederick the Great beat 80,000 Austrians at Leuthen with about 30,000 men, and at Rossbach with 25,000, some 50,000 allies. These are, however, the only instances of victories gained against an enemy with double or more than double in numbers. Charles XII, in the Battle of Narva, we cannot well quote, for the Russians were at that time hardly to be regarded as Europeans. Also, the principal circumstances, even of the battle, are too little known. Bonaparte had at Dresden 120,000 against 220,000, therefore not the double. At Kolin, Frederick the Great did not succeed with 30,000 against 50,000 Austrians, neither did Bonaparte in the desperate Battle of Leipzig, where he was 160,000 strong against 280,000. From this we may infer that it is very difficult, in the present state of Europe, for the most talented general to gain victory over an enemy double his strength. Now, if we see double numbers prove such a weight in the scale against the greatest generals, we may be sure that, in ordinary cases, in small as well as great combats, an important superiority of numbers, but which need not be over 2 to 1, will be sufficient to ensure the victory, however disadvantageous other circumstances may be. Certainly we may imagine a defile which even a tenfold would not suffice to force, but in such a case it can be no question of a battle at all. We think therefore that under our conditions, as well as in all similar ones, the superiority at the decisive point is a matter of capital importance, and that this subject, in the generality of cases, is decidedly the most important of all. The strength at this decisive point depends on the absolute strength of the army and on the skill of making use of it. The first rule is therefore to enter the field with an army as strong as possible. This sounds like a commonplace, but still it is really not so. In order to show that for a long time the strength of forces was by no means regarded as a chief point, we need only observe that in most, and even in the most detailed histories of the war in the 18th century, the strength of the armies is either not given at all, or only incidentally, and in no case is any special value laid upon it. Tempelhof, in his History of the 7 Years' War, is the earliest writer who gives it regularly, but at the same time he does it only very superficially. Even Massenbach, in his manifold critical observations of the Prussian campaigns of 1793 and 94, in the Vosges, talks a great deal about hills and valleys, roads and footpaths, but doesn't say a syllable about mutual strength. Another proof lies in the wonderful notion which haunted the heads of many critical historians, according to which there was a certain size of an army which was the best, a normal strength, beyond which the forces in excess were burdensome rather than serviceable. Lastly, there are a number of instances to be found in which all the available forces were not really brought into the battle or into the war, because the superiority of numbers was not considered to have that importance which, in the nature of things, belongs to it. If we are thoroughly penetrated with the conviction that with a considerable superiority of numbers everything possible is to be effected, then it cannot fail that this clear conviction reacts on the preparations for the war, so as to make us appear in the field with as many troops as possible, and either to give us ourselves the superiority, or at least guard against the enemy obtaining it. So much for what concerns the absolute force with which the army is to be conducted. The measure of this absolute force is determined by the government, and although with the determination the real action of the war commences, and it forms an essential part of the strategy of the war, still in most cases the general who is in command of these forces in the war must regard their absolute strength as a given quantity, whether it be that he has no voice in fixing it, or that circumstances prevented a sufficient expansion being given to it. There remains nothing, therefore, where an absolute superiority is not attainable, but to produce a relative one at the decisive point by making skillful use of what we have. The calculation of space and time appears to be the most essential thing to this end, and this has caused that subject to be regarded as one which embraces nearly the whole art of using military forces. Indeed, some have gone so far as to ascribe to great strategists and tacticians a mental organ peculiarly adapted to this point. But the calculation of time and space, although it lies universally at the foundation of strategy, and is to a certain extent its daily bread, is still neither the most difficult nor the most decisive one. If we take an unprejudiced glance at military history, we shall find that the instances in which the mistakes in such a calculation have proved the cause of serious losses are very rare, at least in strategy. But if the conception of a skillful combination of time and space is fully to account for every instance of a resolute and active commander beating several separate opponents with one and the same army, Frederick the Great, Bonaparte, then we perplex ourselves unnecessarily with conventional language. For the sake of clearness and the profitable use of conceptions, it is necessary that things should always be called by their right names. The right appreciation of their opponents, Daun, Schwarzenberg, the audacity to leave for a short space of time a small force only before them, energy in forced marches, boldness in sudden attacks, the intensified activity which great souls acquire in the moment of danger, these are the grounds of such victories. And what have these to do with the ability to make an exact calculation of two such simple things as time and space? But even this ricocheting play of forces, when the victories at Rossbach and Montmirail give the impulse to victories at Leuthen and Montreux, to which generals on the defensive have often trusted, is still, if we would be clear and exact, only a rare occurrence in history. Much more frequently, the relative superiority, that is, the skillful assemblage of superior forces at the decisive point, has its foundation in the right appreciation of those points, in the judicious direction which by that means has been given to the forces from the very first, and in the resolution required to sacrifice the unimportant to the advantage of the important, that is, to keep the forces concentrated in an overpowering mass. In this, Frederick the Great and Bonaparte are particularly characteristic. We think we have now allotted to the superiority in numbers the importance which belongs to it. It is to be regarded as the fundamental idea, always to be aimed at before all, and as far as possible. But to regard it on this account as a necessary condition of victory would be a complete misconception of our exposition. In the conclusion to be drawn from it lies nothing more than the value which should attach to the numerical strength in the combat. If that strength is to be made as great as possible, then the maxim is satisfied. A review of the total relations must then decide whether or not the combat is to be avoided for want of sufficient force. Chapter 9. The Surprise. From the subject of the foregoing chapter, the general endeavour to attain a relative superiority, there follows another endeavour which must consequently be just as general in its nature. This is the surprise of the enemy. It lies more or less at the foundation of all undertakings, for without it the preponderance at the decisive point is not properly conceivable. Surprise is, therefore, not only the means to the attainment of numerical superiority, but it is also to be regarded as a substantive principle in itself, on account of its moral effect. When it is successful in a high degree, confusion and broken courage in the enemy's ranks are the consequences, and of the degree to which these multiply success, there are examples enough, great and small. We are not now speaking of the particular surprise which belongs to the attack, but of the endeavour by measures generally, and especially by the distribution of forces, to surprise the enemy, which can be imagined just as well in the defensive, and which in the tactical defence particularly is a chief point. We say surprise lies at the foundation of all undertakings without exception, only in very different degrees according to the nature of the undertaking and other circumstances. This difference indeed originates in the properties and peculiarities of the army and its commander, in those even of the government. Secrecy and rapidity are the two factors in this product, and these suppose in the government and the commander-in-chief great energy, and on the part of the army a high sense of military duty. With effeminacy and loose principles, it is vain to calculate upon a surprise. But so general, indeed so indispensable, as is this endeavour, and true as it is that it is never wholly unproductive of effect, still it is not the less true that it seldom succeeds to a remarkable degree, and this follows from the nature of the idea itself. We should form an erroneous conception if we believed that by this means chiefly there is much to be attained in war. In idea it promises a great deal. In the execution it generally sticks fast by the friction of the whole machine. In tactics the surprise is very much more at home, for the very natural reason that all times and spaces are on a smaller scale. It will, therefore, in strategy, be the more feasible in proportion as the measures lie nearer to the province of tactics, and more difficult the higher up they lie toward the province of policy. The preparations for a war usually occupy several months. The assembly of an army at its principal positions requires generally the formation of depots and magazines and long marches, the object of which can be guessed soon enough. It therefore rarely happens that one state surprises another by a war, or by the direction which it gives the mass of its forces. In the 17th and 18th centuries, when war turned very much upon sieges, it was a frequent aim, and a peculiar and important chapter in the art of war, to invest a strong place unexpectedly, but even that only rarely succeeded. On the other hand, with things which can be done in a day or two, a surprise is much more conceivable, and therefore also it is often not difficult thus to gain a march upon the enemy, and thereby a position, a point of country, a road, and such. But it is evident that what surprise gains in this way in easy execution, it loses in the efficacy. As the greater the efficacy, the greater always the difficulty of execution. Whoever thinks that with such surprises on a small scale he may collect great results, as, for example, the gain of a battle, the capture of an important magazine, believes in something which is certainly very possible to imagine, but for which there is no warrant in history. For there are upon the whole very few instances where anything great has resulted from such surprises, from which we may justly conclude that inherent difficulties lie in the way of their successes. Certainly whoever would consult history on such points must not depend on sundry battle-steeds of historical critics, on their wise dicta and self-complacent terminology, but look at the facts with his own eyes. There is, for instance, a certain day in the campaign in Silesia, 1761, which in this respect has attained a kind of notoriety. It is the 22nd of July, on which Frederick the Great gained on Launden the march to Neussen, near Nisa, by which, as is said, the junction of the Austrian and Russian armies in Upper Silesia became impossible, and therefore a period of 4 weeks was gained by the king. Whoever reads over this occurrence carefully in the principal histories and considers it impartially will, in the march of the 22nd July, never find this importance, and generally in the whole of the fashionable logic on this subject he will see nothing but contradictions. But in the proceedings of Launden, in this renowned period of manoeuvres, much that is unaccountable. How could one, with a thirst for truth and clear conviction, accept such historical evidence? When we promise ourselves great effects in a campaign from the principle of surprising, we think upon great activity, rapid resolutions, and forced marches as the means of producing them, but that these things, even when forthcoming in a very high degree, will not always produce the desired effect, we see in examples given by generals whom may be allowed to have had the greatest talent in the use of these means, Frederick the Great and Bonaparte. The first, when he left Dresden so suddenly in July 1760, and falling upon Lasky, then turned against Dresden, gained nothing by the whole of that intermezzo, but rather placed his affairs in a condition notably worse, as the fortress Glatz fell in the meantime. In 1813, Bonaparte turned suddenly from Dresden twice against Blucher, to say nothing of his incursion into Bohemia from Upper Lusatia, and both times without in the least attaining his object. There were blows in the air which only cost him time and force, and might have placed him in a dangerous position in Dresden. Therefore, even in this field, a surprise does not necessarily meet with great success through the mere activity, energy, and resolution of a commander. It must be favoured by other circumstances, but we by no means deny that there can be success. We only connect with it a necessity of favourable circumstances, which certainly do not occur very frequently, and which the commander can seldom bring about himself. Just those two generals afford each a striking illustration of this. We take first Bonaparte in his famous enterprise against Blucher's army in February 1814, when it was separated from the Grand Army and descending the Marne. It would not be easy to find 2 days' march to surprise the enemy productive of greater results than this. Blucher's army, extended over a distance of 3 days' march, was beaten in detail, and suffered a loss nearly equal to that of a defeat in a great battle. This was completely the effect of a surprise, for if Blucher had thought of such a near possibility of an attack from Bonaparte, he would have organised his march quite differently. To this mistake of Blucher's, the result is to be attributed. Bonaparte did not know all these circumstances, and so there was a piece of good fortune that mixed itself up in his favour. It is the same with the Battle of Liegnitz, 1760. Frederick the Great attained this fine victory through altering, during the night, a position which he had just before taken up. Loudon was through this completely surprised, and lost 70 pieces of artillery and 10,000 men. Although Frederick the Great had at this time adopted the principle of moving backwards and forwards in order to make a battle impossible, or at least to disconcert the enemy's plans, still the alteration of position on the night of the 14th and 15th was not made exactly with that intention, but as the king himself says, because the position of the 14th did not please him. Here, therefore, also chance was hard at work. Without this happy conjunction of the attack and the change of position in the night, and the difficult nature of the country, the result would not have been the same. Also, in the higher and highest province of strategy, there are some instances of surprises fruitful in results. We shall only cite the brilliant marches of the great Elector against the Swedes from Franconia to Pomerania, and from the Mark, Brandenburg, to the Pregel in 1757, and the celebrated passage of the Alps by Bonaparte, 1800. In the latter case, an army gave up its whole theatre of war by a capitulation, and in 1757 another army was very near giving up its theatre of war and itself as well. Lastly, as an instance of a war wholly unexpected, we may bring forth the invasion of Silesia by Frederick the Great. Great and powerful are here the results everywhere, but such events are not common in history if we do not confuse them with cases in which a state, for want of activity and energy, Saxony, 1756, and Russia, 1812, has not completed its preparations in time. Now, there still remains an observation which concerns the essence of the thing. A surprise can only be effected by that party which gives the law to the other, and he who is in the right gives the law. If we surprise the adversary by a wrong measure, then instead of reaping good results, we may have to bear a sound blow in return, and in any case, the adversary need not trouble himself much about our surprise. He has, in our mistake, the means of turning off the evil. As the offensive includes in itself much more positive action than the defensive, so the surprise is certainly more in its place with the assailant, but by no means invariably, as we shall hereafter see. Mutual surprises by the offensive and defensive may therefore meet, and then that one will have the advantage who has hit the nail on the head the best. So should it be, but practical life does not keep to this line so exactly, and that for a very simple reason. The moral effects which attend a surprise often convert the worst case into a good one for the side they favour, and do not allow the other to make any regular determination. We have here in view, more than anywhere else, not only the chief commander, but each single one, because a surprise has the effect in particular of greatly loosening unity, so that the individuality of each separate leader easily comes to light. Much depends here on the general relation in which the two parties stand to each other. If the one side, through a general moral superiority, can intimidate and outdo the other, then he can make use of the surprise with more success, and even reap good fruit where properly he should come to ruin. Chapter 10. Stratagem. Stratagem implies a concealed intention, and therefore is opposed to straightforward dealing, in the same way as wit is the opposite of direct proof. It has therefore nothing in common with the means of persuasion, of self-interest, of force, but a great deal to do with deceit, because that likewise conceals its object. It is itself a deceit as well when it is done, but still it differs from what is commonly called deceit in this respect, that there is no direct breach of word. The deceiver by stratagem leaves it to the person themselves, whom he is deceiving, to commit the errors of understanding which at last, flowing into one result, suddenly change the nature of things in his eyes. We may therefore say, as wit is sleight of hand with ideas and conceptions, so stratagem is sleight of hand with actions. At first it appears as if strategy had not improperly derived its name from stratagem, and that, with all the real and apparent changes which the whole character of war has undergone since the time of the Greeks, this term still points to its real nature. If we leave to tactics the actual delivery of the blow, the battle itself, and look upon strategy as the art of using this means with skill, then besides the forces of the character, such as burning ambition, which always presses like a spring, a strong will which hardly bends, and such, there seems no subjective quality so suited to guide and inspire strategic activity as stratagem. The general tendency to surprise, treated of in the foregoing chapter, points to this conclusion, for there is a degree of stratagem, be it ever so small, which lies at the foundation of every attempt to surprise. But however much we feel a desire to see the actors in war outdo each other in hidden activity, readiness, and stratagem, still we must admit that these qualities show themselves but little in history, and have rarely been able to work their way to the surface from amongst the mass of relations and circumstances. The explanation of this is obvious, and it is almost identical with the subject matter of the preceding chapter. Strategy knows no other activity than the regulating of combat with the measures which relate to it. It has no concern, like ordinary life, with the transactions which consist merely of words, that is, in expressions, declarations, and such. But these, which are very inexpensive, are chiefly the means with which the wily one takes in those he practises upon. That which there is like it in war, plans and orders given merely as make-believers, false reports sent on purpose to the enemy, is usually of so little effect in the strategic field that it is only resorted to in particular cases which offer of themselves, therefore cannot be regarded as spontaneous action which emanates from the leader. But such measures as carrying out the arrangements for a battle, so far as to impose upon the enemy, require a considerable expenditure of time and power. Of course, the greater the impression to be made, the greater the expenditure in these respects. And as this is usually not given for the purpose, very few demonstrations, so-called, in strategy, affect the object for which they are designed. In fact, it is dangerous to detach large forces for any length of time merely for a trick, because there is always the risk of its being done in vain, and then these forces are wanted at the decisive point. The chief actor in war is always thoroughly sensible of this sober truth, and therefore he has no desire to play at tricks of agility. The bitter earnestness of necessity presses so fully into direct action that there is no room for that game. In a word, the pieces on the strategical chessboard want that mobility which is the element of stratagem and subtlety. The conclusion that we draw is that a correct and penetrating eye is a more necessary and more useful quality for a general than craftiness, although that also does no harm if it does not exist at the expense of necessary qualities of heart, which is only too often the case. But the weaker the forces which are under the command of strategy, so much the more they become adapted for stratagem, so that to the quite feeble and little, for whom no prudence, no sagacity is any longer sufficient, at the point where all art seems to forsake him, stratagem offers itself as a last resource. The more helpless his situation, the more everything presses toward one single desperate blow, the more readily stratagem comes to the aid of his boldness. Let loose from all further calculations, freed from all concern for the future, boldness and stratagem intensify each other, and thus collect at one point an infinitesimal glimmering of hope into a single ray, which may likewise serve to kindle a flame. End of Book 3, Chapters 6 through 10. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. On War by Karl von Clausewitz. Translated by Colonel J. J. Graham. Book 3, Chapter 11. Assembly of Forces in Space. The best strategy is always to be very strong, first generally, then at the decisive point. Therefore, apart from the energy which creates the army, a work which is not always done by the general, there is no more imperative and no simpler law for strategy than to keep the forces concentrated. No portion is to be separated from the main body unless called away by some urgent necessity. On this maxim we stand firm, and look upon it as a guide to be depended upon. What are the reasonable grounds on which a detachment of forces may be made, we shall learn by degrees. Then we shall also see that this principle cannot have the same general effects in every war, but that these are different according to the means and end. It seems incredible, and yet it has happened 100 times. The troops have been divided and separated merely through a mysterious feeling of conventional manner, without any clear perception of the reason. If the concentration of the whole force is acknowledged as the norm, and every division and separation as an exception which must be justified, then not only will that folly be completely avoided, but also many an erroneous ground for separating troops will be barred admission. Chapter 12. Assembly of Forces in Time. We have here to deal with a conception which in real life diffuses many kinds of illusory light. A clear definition and development of the idea is therefore necessary, and we hope to be allowed a short analysis. War is the shock of two opposing forces in collision with each other, from which it follows, as a matter of course, that the stronger not only destroys the other, but carries it forward with its movement. This fundamentally admits of no successive action of powers, but makes the simultaneous application of all forces intended for the shock appear as a primordial law of war. So it is in reality, but only so far as the struggle resembles also in practice a mechanical shock. But when it consists in a lasting mutual action of destructive forces, then we can certainly imagine a successive action of forces. This is the case in tactics, principally because firearms form the basis of all tactics, but also from other reasons as well. If in a fire combat 1,000 men are opposed to 500, then the gross loss is calculated from the amount of the enemy's force and our own. 1,000 men fire twice as many shots as 500, but no more shots will take effect on the 1,000 than on the 500, because it is assumed that they stand closer order than the other. If we were to suppose the number of hits to be double, then the losses on each side would be equal. From the 500 there would be, for example, 200 disabled, and out of the body of 1,000, likewise the same. Now, if the 500 had kept another body of equal number quite out of the fire, then both sides would have 800 effective men. But of these, on the one side there would be 500 men quite fresh, fully supplied with ammunition, and in their full vigour. On the other side, only 800 all alike shaken in their order, in want of sufficient ammunition, and weakened in physical force. The assumption that 1,000 men, merely on account of their greater number, would lose twice as many as 500 would have lost in their place, is certainly not correct. Therefore, the greater loss which the side suffers that has placed the half of its force in reserve must be regarded as a disadvantage in that original formation. Further, it must be admitted that, in the generality of cases, the 1,000 men would have the advantage at the first commencement of being able to drive their opponent out of his position and force him to a retrograde movement. Now, whether these two advantages are a counterpoise to the disadvantage of finding ourselves with 800 men to a certain extent disorganized by the combat, opposed to an enemy who is not materially weaker in numbers, and who has 500 quite fresh troops, is one that cannot be decided by pursuing an analysis further. We must here rely upon experience, and there will scarcely be an officer experienced in war who will not, in the generality of cases, assign the advantage to that side which has the fresh troops. In this way it becomes evident how the employment of too many forces in combat may be disadvantageous. For whatever advantages the superiority may give in the first moment, we may have to pay dearly for in the next. But this danger only endures as long as the disorder, the state of confusion and weakness, lasts. In a word, up to the crisis which every combat brings with it, even for the conqueror. Within the duration of this relaxed state of exhaustion, the appearance of a proportionate number of fresh troops is decisive. But when this disordering effect of victory stops, and therefore only the moral superiority remains, which every victory gives, then it is no longer possible for fresh troops to restore the combat. They would only be carried along in the general movement. A beaten army cannot be brought back to victory a day after by means of a strong reserve. Here we find ourselves at the source of a highly material difference between tactics and strategy. The tactical results, the results within the four corners of the battle and before its close, lie for the most part within the limits of that period of disorder and weakness, but the strategic result, that is to say, the result of the total combat, of the victories realized, let them be small or great, lies completely beyond, outside of that period. It is only when the results of partial combats have bound themselves together into an independent whole that the strategic result appears, but then the state of crisis is over, the forces have resumed their original form, and are now only weakened to the extent of those actually destroyed, placed hors de combat. The consequence of this difference is that tactics can make a continued use of forces, strategy only a simultaneous one. If I cannot, in tactics, decide all by the first success, if I have to fear the next moment, it follows of itself that I employ only so much of my force for that success of the first moment as appears sufficient for that object, and keep the rest beyond the reach of fire or conflict of any kind, in order to be able to oppose fresh troops to fresh, or with such, to overcome those that are exhausted. But it is not so in strategy. Partly, as we have just shown, it has not so much reason to fear a reaction after a success realized, because with that success the crisis stops. Partly, all the forces strategically employed are not necessarily weakened. Only so much of them as have been tactically in conflict with the enemy's force, that is, engaged in partial combat, are weakened by it. Consequently, only so much as was unavoidably necessary, but by no means all which was strategically in conflict with the enemy, unless tactics has expended them unnecessarily, corps which, on account of the general superiority in numbers, have either been little or not at all engaged, whose presence alone has assisted in the result, are, after the decision, the same as they were before, and for new enterprises as efficient as if they had been entirely inactive. How greatly such corps, which thus constitute our excess, may contribute to the total success is evident in itself. Indeed, it is not difficult to see how they may even diminish considerably the loss of the forces engaged in tactical conflict on our side. If, therefore, in strategy the loss does not increase with the number of troops employed, but is often diminished by it, and if, as a natural consequence, the decision in our favour is, by that means, the more certain, then it follows that in strategy we can never employ too many forces, and consequently also they must be applied simultaneously to the immediate purpose. But we must vindicate this proposition upon another ground. We have hitherto only spoken of the combat itself. It is the real activity in war, but men, time, and space, which appear as the elements of this activity, must at the same time be kept in view, and the results of their influence brought into consideration also. Fatigue, exertion, and privation constitute in war a special principle of destruction, not essentially belonging to contest, but more or less inseparably bound up with it, and certainly one which especially belongs to strategy. They no doubt exist in tactics as well, and perhaps they're in a higher degree, but as the duration of the tactical acts is shorter, therefore the small effects of exertion and privation on them can come but little into consideration. But in strategy, on the other hand, where time and space are on a larger scale, their influence is not only always very considerable, but quite often decisive. It is not at all uncommon for a victorious army to lose many more by sickness than on the field of battle. If, therefore, we look at this sphere of destruction in strategy in the same manner as we have considered that of fire and close combat in tactics, then we may well imagine that everything which comes within its vortex will, at the end of the campaign or any other strategic period, be reduced to a state of weakness, which makes the arrival of a fresh force decisive. We might therefore conclude that there is a motive in the one case, as well as the other, to strive for the first success with as few forces as possible, in order to keep up this fresh force to the last. In order to estimate exactly this conclusion, which in many cases, in practice, will have a great appearance of truth, we must direct our attention to the separate ideas which it contains, In the first place, we must not confuse the notion of reinforcement with that of fresh unused troops. There are few campaigns at the end of which an increase of force is not earnestly desired by the conqueror as well as the conquered, and indeed should appear decisive. But that is not the point here, for the increase of force could not be necessary if the force had been so much larger at the first. But it would be contrary to all experience to suppose that an army coming fresh into the field is to be esteemed higher in point of moral value than an army already in the field, just as a tactical reserve is more to be esteemed than a body of troops which has been already severely handled in the fight. Just as much as an unfortunate campaign lowers the courage and moral powers of an army, a successful one raises these elements in their value. In the generality of cases, therefore, these influences are compensated, and then there remains, over and above, as clear gain, the habituation of war. We should, besides, look more here to successful than to unsuccessful campaigns, because when the greater probability of the latter may be seen beforehand, without doubt forces are wanted, and therefore the reserving a portion for future use is out of the question. This point being settled, then the question is, do the losses which a force sustains through fatigues and privations increase in proportion to the size of the force, as in the case in combat? And to that we answer, no. The fatigues of war result in a great measure from the dangers with which every moment of the active war is more or less impregnated. To encounter these dangers at all points, to proceed onwards with security in the execution of one's plans, gives employment to a multitude of agencies which make up the tactical and strategic service of the army. This service is more difficult the weaker an army is, and easier as its numerical superiority over the enemy increases. Who can doubt this? The campaign against a much weaker enemy will therefore cost smaller efforts than against one who is just as strong or stronger. So much for the fatigues. It is somewhat different with the privations. They consist chiefly of two things, the want of food and the want of shelter for the troops, either in quarters or in suitable camps. Both these wants will no doubt be in greater proportion as the number of men on one spot is greater, but does not the superiority in force afford also the best means of spreading out and finding more room, and therefore more means of subsistence and shelter? If Bonaparte, in his invasion of Russia in 1812, concentrated his army in great masses upon one single road in a manner never heard of before, and thus caused privations equally unparalleled, we must ascribe it to his maxim that it is impossible to be too strong at the decisive point. Whether in this instance he did not strain the principle too far is a question which would be out of place here, but it is certain that if he had made a point of avoiding the stress which was by that means brought about, he had only to advance on a greater breadth of front. Room was not wanted for the purpose in Russia, and in very few cases can it be wanted. Therefore, from this no ground can be deduced to prove that the simultaneous employment of very superior forces must produce greater weakening. But now, supposing that in spite of the general relief afforded by setting apart a portion of the army, wind and weather and the toils of war had produced a diminution even on the part which as a spare force would have been reserved for later use, still we must take a comprehensive general view of the whole, and therefore ask, will this diminution of force suffice to counterbalance the gain in forces which we, through our superiority in numbers, may be able to make in more ways than one? But there still remains a most important point to be noticed. In a partial combat, the force required to obtain a great result can be approximately estimated without much difficulty, and, consequently, we can form an idea of what is superfluous. In strategy, this may be said to be impossible, because the strategic result has no such well-defined object, and no such circumscribed limits as the tactical. Thus, what can be looked upon in tactics as an excess of power may be regarded in strategy as a means to give expansion to success, if opportunity offers for it. With the magnitude of the success, the gain in force increases at the same time, and in this way the superiority of numbers may soon reach a point which the most careful economy of forces could never have attained. By means of his enormous numerical superiority, Bonaparte was enabled to reach Moscow in 1812, and to take that central capital. Had he, by means of this superiority, succeeded in completely defeating the Russian army, he would, in all probability, have concluded a peace in Moscow which in any other way was much less attainable. This example is used to explain the idea, not to prove it, which would require a circumstantial demonstration, for which this is not the place. All these reflections bear merely upon the idea of a successive employment of forces, and not upon the conception of a reserve properly so called, which they, no doubt, come in contact with throughout, but which, as we shall see in the following chapter, is connected with some other considerations. What we desire to establish here is that if in tactics the military force, through the mere duration of actual employment, suffers a diminution of power, if time, therefore, appears as a factor in the result, this is not the case in strategy in a material degree. The destructive effects which are also produced upon the forces in strategy by time are partly diminished through their mass, partly made good in other ways, and therefore in strategy it cannot be an object to make time an ally on its own account by bringing troops successively into action. We say on its own account, for the influence which time, on account of other circumstances which it brings about, but which are different from itself, can have, indeed must necessarily have, for one of the two parties, is quite another thing. It is anything but indifferent or unimportant, and will be the subject of consideration hereafter. The rule which we have been seeking to set forth is, therefore, that all forces which are available and destined for a strategic object should be simultaneously applied to it, and this application will be so much more the complete, the more everything is compressed into one act and into one movement. But still there is in strategy a renewal of effort and a persistent action which, as a chief means towards the ultimate success, is more particularly not to be overlooked. It is the continual development of new forces. This is also the subject of another chapter, and we only refer to it here in order to prevent the reader from having something in view of which we have not been speaking. We now turn to a subject very closely connected with our present considerations, which must be settled before full light can be thrown on the whole. We mean the strategic reserve. Chapter 13. Strategic Reserve. A reserve has two objects which are very distinct from each other, namely, first, the prolongation and renewal of the combat, and secondly, for use in case of unforeseen events. The first object implies the utility of a successive application of forces, and on that account cannot occur in strategy. Cases in which a corps is sent to succour a point which is supposed to be about to fall are plainly to be placed in the category of the second object, as the resistance which has to be offered here could not have been sufficiently foreseen. But a corps which is destined expressly to prolong the combat, and with that object in view is placed in the rear, would be only a corps placed out of reach of fire, but under the command and at the general disposition of the general commanding in the action, and accordingly would be a tactical, and not a strategic, reserve. But the necessity for a force ready for unforeseen events may also take place in strategy, and, consequently, there may also be a strategic reserve, but only where unforeseen events are imaginable. In tactics, where the enemy's measures are generally first ascertained by direct sight, and where they may be concealed by every wood, every fold of undulating ground, we must naturally always be alive more or less to the possibility of unforeseen events, in order to strengthen, subsequently, those points which appear too weak, and in fact to modify generally the disposition of our troops, so as to make it correspond better to that of the enemy. Such cases must also happen in strategy, because the strategic act is directly linked to the tactical. In strategy also, many a measure is first adopted in consequence of what is actually seen, or in consequence of uncertain reports arriving from day to day, or even from hour to hour, and lastly from the actual results of the combats. It is, therefore, an essential condition of strategic command that, according to the degree of uncertainty, forces must be kept in reserve against future contingencies. In the defensive generally, but particularly in the defence of certain obstacles of ground like rivers, hills, and such contingencies, as is well known, happen constantly. But this uncertainty diminishes in proportion as the strategic activity has less of the tactical character and ceases almost altogether in those regions where it borders on politics. The direction in which the enemy leads his columns to the combat can be perceived by actual sight only. Where he intends to pass a river is learnt from a few preparations which are made shortly before. The line by which he proposes to invade our country is usually announced by all the newspapers before a pistol shot has been fired. The greater the nature of the measure, the less it will take the enemy by surprise. Time and space are so considerable, the circumstances out of which the action proceeds so public and little susceptible to alteration, that the coming event is either made known in good time or can be discovered with reasonable certainty. On the other hand, the use of a reserve in this province of strategy, even if one were available, will always be less efficacious the more the measure has a tendency towards being one of a general nature. We have seen that the decision of a partial combat is nothing in itself, but that all partial combats only find their complete solution in the decision of the total combat. But even this decision of the total combat has only a relative meaning of many different gradations, according as the force over which the victory has been gained forms a more or less great and important part of the whole. The lost battle of a corps may be repaired by the victory of the army. Even the lost battle of an army may not only be counterbalanced by the gain of a more important one, but converted into a fortunate event. The 2 days of Kulm, August 29 and 30, 1813. No one can doubt this, but it is just as clear that the weight of each victory, the successful issue of each total combat, is so much the more substantial, the more important the part conquered, and that therefore the possibility of repairing the loss by subsequent events diminishes in the same proportion. In another place we shall have to examine this in more detail. It suffices for the present to have drawn attention to the indubitable existence of this progression. If we now add lastly to these two considerations the third, which is that if the persistent use of forces in tactics always shifts the general result to the end of the whole act, law of the simultaneous use of forces in strategy, on the contrary, lets the principal result, which need not be the final one, take place almost always at the commencement of the great or whole act, then in these three results we have ground sufficient to find strategic reserves always more superfluous, always more useless, always more dangerous, the more general their destination. The point where the idea of a strategic reserve begins to become inconsistent is not difficult to determine. It lies in the supreme decision. Employment must be given to all the forces within the space of the supreme decision, and every reserve, active force available, which is only intended for use after that decision, is opposed to common sense. If, therefore, tactics has in its reserves the means of not only meeting unforeseen dispositions on the part of the enemy, but also of repairing that which can never be foreseen, the result of the combat, should that be unfortunate, strategy, on the other hand, must, at least as far as relates to the capital result, renounce the use of these means. As a rule, it can only repair the losses sustained at one point by advantages gained at another. In a few cases, by moving troops from one point to another, the idea of preparing such reserves, by placing forces in reserve beforehand, can never be entertained in strategy. We have pointed out as an absurdity the idea of a strategic reserve which is not to cooperate in the capital result, and as it is so beyond doubt, we should not have been led into such an analysis as we have made in these two chapters, were it not that, in the disguise of other ideas, it looks like something better and frequently makes its appearance. One person sees in it the acme of strategic sagacity and foresight, another rejects it, and with it the idea of any reserve, consequently even of a tactical one. This confusion of ideas is transferred to real life, and if we would see a memorable instance of it, we have only to call to mind that Prussia in 1806 left a reserve of 20,000 men cantoned in the Mark under Prince Eugene of Württemberg, which could not possibly reach the Saale in time to be of any use, and that another force of 25,000 men belonging to this power remained in East and South Prussia, destined only to be put on a war footing afterwards as a reserve. After these examples, we cannot be accused of having been fighting with windmills. Chapter 14. Economy of Forces. The road of reason, as we have said, seldom allows itself to be reduced to a mathematical line by principles and opinions. There remains always a certain margin. But it is the same in all the practical arts of life. For the lines of beauty there are no abscissae and ordinates. Circles and ellipses are not described by means of their algebraical formulae. The actor in war, therefore, soon finds he must trust himself to the delicate tact of judgment which, founded on natural quickness of perception and educated by reflection, almost unconsciously seizes upon the right. He soon finds that at one time he must simplify the law by reducing it to some prominent characteristic points which form his rules, that at another the adopted method must become the staff on which he leans. As one of these simplified characteristic points as a mental appliance, we look upon the principle of watching continually over the cooperation of all forces, or in other words, of keeping constantly in view that no part of them should ever be idle. Whoever has forces where the enemy does not give them sufficient employment, whoever has part of his forces on the march, that is, allows them to lie dead, while the enemies are fighting, he is a bad manager of his forces. In this sense there is a waste of forces, which is even worse than their employment to no purpose. If there must be action, then the first point is that all parts act, because the most purposeless activity still keeps employed and destroys a portion of the enemy's force, whilst troops completely inactive are, for the moment, quite neutralized. Unmistakably, this idea is bound up with the principles contained in the last 3 chapters. It is the same truth, but seen from a somewhat more comprehensive point of view and condensed into a single conception. Chapter 15. Geometrical Element. The length to which the geometrical element, or form in the disposition of military force in war, can become a predominant principle, we see in the art of fortification, where geometry looks after the great and the little. Also in tactics it plays a great part. It is the basis of elementary tactics, or the theory of moving troops, but in field fortification, as well as in the theory of positions and of their attack, its angles and lines rule like lawgivers who have to decide the contest. Many things here were at one time misapplied, and others were mere fribbles. Still, however, in the tactics of the present day, in which in every combat the aim is to surround the enemy, the geometrical element has attained anew a great importance in a very simple but constantly recurring application. Nevertheless, in tactics where all is more movable, where the moral forces, individual traits, and chance are more influential than in a war of sieges, the geometrical element can never attain to the same degree of supremacy as in the latter. But less still is its influence in strategy. Certainly here also, form in the disposition of troops, the shape of countries and states is of great importance, but the geometrical element is not decisive, as in fortification, and not nearly so important as in tactics. The manner in which this influence exhibits itself can only be shown by degrees at those places where it makes its appearance, and deserves notice. Here we wish more to direct attention to the difference which there is between tactics and strategy in relation to it. In tactics, time and space quickly dwindle to their absolute minimum. If a body of troops is attacked in flank and rear by the enemy, it soon gets to a point where retreat no longer remains. Such a position is very close to an absolute impossibility of continuing to fight. It must therefore extricate itself from it, or avoid getting into it. This gives to all combinations aiming at this from the first commencement a great efficiency, which chiefly consists in the disquietude which it causes the enemy as to consequences. This is why the geometrical disposition of the forces is such an important factor in the tactical product. In strategy, this is only faintly reflected on account of the greater space and time. We do not fire from one theatre of war upon another, and often weeks and months must pass before a strategic movement designed to surround the enemy can be executed. Further, the distances are so great that the probability of hitting the right point at last, even with the best arrangements, is but small. In strategy, therefore, the scope for such combinations, that is, for those resting on the geometrical element, is much smaller, and for the same reason the effect of an advantage once actually gained at any point is much greater. Such advantage has time to bring all its effects to maturity before it is disturbed, or quite neutralized therein, by any counteracting apprehensions. We therefore do not hesitate to regard as an established truth that in strategy more depends on the number and magnitude of victorious combats than on the form of the great lines by which they are connected. A view just the reverse has been a favourite theme of modern theory, because a great importance was supposed to be thus given to strategy, and, as the higher functions of the mind were seen in strategy, it was thought by that means to ennoble war, and, as it was said, through a new substitution of ideas, to make it more scientific. We hold it to be one of the principal uses of a complete theory openly to expose such vagaries, and as the geometrical element is the fundamental idea from which theory usually proceeds, therefore we have expressly brought out this point in strong relief. End of Book 3, Chapters 11 through 15. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia. Book 3, Chapters 16 through 18 of On War. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. On War by Karl von Clausewitz, translated by Colonel J. J. Graham. Book 3, Chapter 16. On the suspension of the act in warfare. If one considers war as an act of mutual destruction, we must, of necessity, imagine both parties as making some progress. But at the same time, as regards the existing moment, we must almost as necessarily suppose the one party in a state of expectation, and only the other actually advancing. For circumstances can never be actually the same on both sides, or continue so. In time a change must ensue, from which it follows that the present moment is more favourable to one side than the other. Now, if we suppose that both commanders have a full knowledge of this circumstance, then the one has a motive for action, which, at the same time, is a motive for the other to wait. Therefore, according to this, it cannot be for the interest of both at the same time to advance, nor can waiting be for the interest of both at the same time. This opposition of interest as regards the object is not deduced here from the principle of general polarity, and therefore is not in opposition to the argument in the 5th chapter of the 2nd book. It depends on the fact that here in reality the same thing is at once an incentive or motive to both commanders, namely the probability of improving or impairing their position by future action. But even if we suppose the possibility of a perfect equality of circumstances in this respect, or if we take into account that through imperfect knowledge of their mutual position such an equality may appear to the two commanders to subsist, still the difference of political objects does away with the possibility of suspension. One of the parties must of necessity be assumed politically to be the aggressor, because no war could take place from defensive intentions on both sides. But the aggressor has the positive object, the defender merely a negative one. To the first, then, belongs the positive action, for it is only by that means that he can attain the positive object. Therefore, in cases where both parties are in precisely similar circumstances, the aggressor is called upon to act by virtue of his positive object. Therefore, from this point of view, a suspension in the act of warfare, strictly speaking, is in contradiction with the nature of the thing, because two armies, being two incompatible elements, should destroy one another unremittingly, just as fire and water can never put themselves in equilibrium, but act and react one upon another until one quite disappears. What would be said of two wrestlers who remained clasped round each other for hours without making a movement. Action in war, therefore, like that of a clock which is wound up, should go on running down in regular motion. But wild as is the nature of war, it still wears the chains of human weakness, and the contradiction we see here, viz., that man seeks and creates dangers which he fears at the same time, will astonish no one. If we cast a glance at military history in general, we find so much the opposite of an incessant advance toward the aim, that standing still and doing nothing is quite plainly the normal condition of an army in the midst of war, acting the exception. This must almost raise a doubt as to the correctness of our conception, but if military history leads to this conclusion when viewed in the mass, the latest series of campaigns redeems our position. The War of the French Revolution shows too plainly its reality, and only proves too clearly its necessity. In these operations, and especially in the campaigns of Bonaparte, the conduct of the war attained to that unlimited degree of energy which we have presented as the natural law of the element. This degree is therefore possible, and if it is possible, then it is necessary. How could anyone, in fact, justify, in the eyes of reason, the expenditure of forces in war if acting was not the object? The baker only heats his oven if he has bread to put in it. The horse is only yoked to the carriage if we mean to drive. Why then make the enormous effort of a war if we look for nothing else by it but like efforts on the part of the enemy? So much in justification of the general principle. Now as to its modifications, as far as they lie in the nature of the thing and are independent of special cases. There are three causes to be noticed here, which appear as innate counterpoises and prevent the over-rapid or uncontrollable movement of the wheelwork. The first, which produces a constant tendency to delay, and is thereby a retarding principle, is the natural timidity and want of resolution in the human mind, a kind of inertia in the moral world, but which is produced not by attractive but by repellent forces, that is to say, by dread of danger and responsibility. In the burning element of war, ordinary natures appear to become heavier. The impulsion given must therefore be stronger and more frequently repeated if the motion is to be a continuous one. The mere idea of the object for which arms have been taken up is seldom sufficient to overcome this resistant force, and if a warlike enterprising spirit is not at the head, who feels himself in war in his natural element, as much as a fish in the ocean, or if there is not the pressure from above of some great responsibility, then standing still will be the order of the day, and progress will be the exception. The second cause is the imperfection of human perception and judgment, which is greater in war than anywhere, because a person hardly knows exactly his own position from one moment to another, and can only conjecture on slight grounds that of the enemy, which is purposely concealed. This often gives rise to the case of both parties looking upon one and the same object as advantageous for them, while in reality the interest of one must preponderate. Thus, then, each may think he acts wisely by waiting another moment, as we have already said in the 5th chapter of the 2nd book. The third cause which catches hold, like a ratchet wheel in machinery, from time to time producing a complete standstill, is the greater strength of the defensive form. A may feel too weak to attack B, from which it does not follow that B is strong enough for an attack on A. The addition of strength which the defensive gives is not merely lost by assuming the offensive, but also passes to the enemy just as, figuratively expressed, the difference of A plus B and A minus B is equal to 2B. Therefore, it may so happen that both parties at one and the same time not only feel themselves too weak to attack, but also are so in reality. Thus, even in the midst of the act of war itself, anxious sagacity and the apprehension of too great danger find vantage ground, by means of which they can exert their power and tame the elementary impetuosity of war. However, at the same time, these causes, without an exaggeration of their effect, would hardly explain the long states of inactivity which took place in military operations in former times, in wars undertaken about interests of no great importance, and in which inactivity consumed 9/10 of the time the troops remained under arms. This feature in these wars is to be traced principally to the influence which the demands of the one party and the condition and feeling of the other exercised over the conduct of the operations, as has already been observed in the chapter on the essence and object of war. These things may obtain such a preponderating influence as to make of war a half-and-half affair. A war is often nothing more than an armed neutrality or a menacing attitude to support negotiations, or an attempt to gain some small advantage by small exertions, and then to wait the tide of circumstances, or a disagreeable treaty obligation, which is fulfilled in the most niggardly way possible. In all these cases, in which the impulse given by interest is slight, and the principle of hostility feeble, in which there is no desire to do much, and also not much to dread from the enemy, in short, where no powerful motives press and drive, cabinets will not risk much in the game. Hence this tame mode of carrying on war, in which the hostile spirit of real war is laid in irons. The more war becomes in this manner devitalized, so much the more its theory becomes destitute of the necessary firm pivots and buttresses for its reasoning. The necessary is constantly diminishing, the accidental constantly increasing. Nevertheless, in this kind of warfare there is also a certain shrewdness. Indeed, its action is perhaps more diversified and more extensive than in the other. Hazard played with rouleau of gold seems changed into a game of commerce with groschen, and on this field, where the commander of war spins out the time with a number of small flourishes, with skirmishes at outposts, half in earnest, half in jest, with long dispositions which end in nothing, with positions and marches which afterwards are designated as skilful only because their infinitesimally small causes are lost, and common sense can make nothing of them, here on this very field many theorists find the real art of war at home. In these feints, parades, half and quarter thrusts of former wars, they find the aim of all theory, the supremacy of mind over matter, and modern wars appear to them mere savage fisticuffs, from which nothing is to be learnt, and which must be regarded as mere retrograde steps towards barbarism. This opinion is as frivolous as the objects to which it relates. Where great forces and great passions are wanting, it is certainly easier for a practised dexterity to show its game. But is then the command of great forces not, in itself, a higher exercise of the intelligent faculties? Is then that kind of conventional sword exercise not comprised in, and belonging to, the other mode of conducting war? Does it not bear the same relation to it as the motions upon a ship to the motions of the ship itself? Truly, it can take place only under the tacit condition that the adversary does no better. And can we tell how long he may choose to respect those conditions? Has not then the French Revolution fallen upon us in the midst of the fancied security of our old system of war, and driven us from Chalons to Moscow? And did not Frederick the Great in like manner surprise the Austrians reposing in their ancient habits of war, and make their monarchy tremble? Woe to the cabinet which, with a shilly-shally policy and a routine-ridden military system, meets with an adversary who, like the rude element, knows no other law than of his intrinsic force. Every deficiency in energy and exertion is then a weight in the scales in favour of the enemy. It is not so easy, then, to change from the fencing posture into that of an athlete, and a slight blow is often sufficient to knock down the whole. The result of all the causes now adduced is, that the hostile action of a campaign does not progress by a continuous, but by an intermittent movement, and that, therefore, between the separate bloody acts there is a period of watching, during which both parties fall into the defensive, and also that usually a higher object causes the principle of aggression to predominate on one side, and thus leaves it, in general, in an advancing position, by which then its proceedings become modified in some degree. Chapter 17. On the Character of Modern War. The attention which must be paid to the character of war, as it is now made, has a great influence upon all plans, especially on strategic ones. Since all methods formerly usual were upset by Bonaparte's luck and boldness, and first-rate powers almost wiped out at a blow, since the Spaniards, by their stubborn resistance, have shown what the general arming of a nation and insurgent measures on a great scale can effect, in spite of weakness and porousness of individual parts, since Russia, by the campaign of 1812, has taught us, first, that an empire of great dimensions is not to be conquered, which might have been easily known before; secondly, that the probability of final success does not in all cases diminish in the same measure as battles, capitals, and provinces are lost, which was formerly an incontrovertible principle with all diplomacists, and therefore made them always ready to enter at once into some bad temporary peace, but that a nation is often strongest in the heart of its country, if the enemy's offensive power has exhausted itself, and with what enormous force the defensive then springs over to the offensive. Further, since Prussia, 1813, has shown that sudden efforts may add to an army sixfold by means of the militia, and that this militia is just as fit for service abroad as in its own country, since all these events have shown what an enormous factor the heart and sentiments of a nation may be in the product of its political and military strength, in fine, since governments have found out all these additional aids, it is not to be expected that they will let them lie idle in future wars, whether it be that danger threatens their own existence, or that relentless ambition drives them on. That a war which is waged with the whole weight of the national power on each side must be organized differently in principle to those where everything is calculated according to the relations of the standing armies to each other, it is easy to perceive. Standing armies once resembled fleets, the land force, the sea force, in their relations to the remainder of the state, and from that the art of war on shore had in it something of naval tactics, which it is now quite lost. Chapter 18. Tension and Rest, the Dynamic Law of War. We have seen in the 16th chapter of this book how, in most campaigns, much more time used to be spent in standing still and in action than in activity. Now, although, as observed in the preceding chapter, we see quite a different character in the present form of war, still it is certain that real action will always be interrupted more or less by long pauses, and this leads to the necessity of our examining more closely the nature of these two phases of war. If there is a suspension of action in war, that is, if neither party wills something positive, there is rest, and consequently equilibrium, but certainly an equilibrium in the largest signification, in which not only the moral and physical war forces, but all relations and interests come into calculation. As soon as ever one of the two parties proposes to himself a new positive object, and commences active steps towards it, even if it is only by preparations, and as soon as the adversary opposes this, there is a tension of powers. This lasts until the decision takes place, that is, until one party either gives up his object, or the other has conceded it to him. This decision, the foundation of which lies always in the combat, combinations which are made on each side, is followed by a movement in one or other direction. When this movement has exhausted itself, either in the difficulties which had to be mastered, in overcoming its own internal friction, or through new resistant forces prepared by the acts of the enemy, then either a state of rest takes place, or a new tension with a decision, and then a new movement, in most cases in the opposite direction. This speculative distinction between equilibrium, tension, and motion is more essential for practical action than may at first sight appear. In a state of rest and of equilibrium, a varied kind of activity may prevail on one side that results from opportunity, and does not aim at a great alteration. Such an activity may contain important combats, even pitched battles, but yet it is still of a quite different nature, and on that account generally different in its effects. If a state of tension exists, the effects of the decision are always greater, partly because a greater force of will and a greater pressure of circumstances manifest themselves therein, partly because everything has to be prepared and arranged for a great movement. The decision in such cases resembles the effect of a mine well closed and tamped, whilst an event in itself perhaps just as great, in a state of rest, is more or less like a mass of powder puffed away in the open air. At the same time, as a matter of course, the state of tension must be imagined in different degrees of intensity, and it may therefore approach gradually by many steps towards the state of rest, so that at last there is a very slight difference between them. Now, the real use which we derive from these reflections is the conclusion that every measure which is taken during a state of tension is more important and more prolific in results than the same measure could be in a state of equilibrium, and that this importance increases immensely in the highest degrees of tension. The cannonade of Valmy, September 20, 1792, decided more than the Battle of Hochkirch, October 14, 1758. In a tract of country which the enemy abandons to us because he cannot defend it, we can settle ourselves differently from what we should do if the retreat of the enemy was only made with a view to a decision more under favourable circumstances. Again, a strategic attack in course of execution, a faulty position, a single false march, may be decisive in its consequence, whilst in a state of equilibrium, such errors must be of a very glaring kind even to excite the activity of the enemy in a general way. Most bygone wars, as we have already said, consisted, so far as regards the greater part of the time, in this state of equilibrium, or at least in such short tensions with long intervals between them, and weak in their effects, that the events to which they gave rise were seldom great successes. Often they were theatrical exhibitions got up in honour of a royal birthday, Hochkirch, or merely satisfying of the honour of the arms, Kunersdorf, or the personal vanity of the commander, Freiburg. That a commander should thoroughly understand these states, that he should have the tact to act in the spirit of them, we hold to be a great requisite, and we have had experience in the campaign of 1806 how far it is sometimes wanting, in that tremendous tension where everything pressed on toward a supreme decision, and that alone with all its consequences should have occupied the whole soul of the commander. Measures were proposed and even partially carried out, such as the reconnaissance toward Franconia, which, at the most, might have given a kind of gentle play of oscillation within a state of equilibrium. Over these blundering schemes and views, absorbing the activity of the army, the really necessary means, which could alone save, were lost sight of. But this speculative distinction which we have made is also necessary for our further progress in the construction of our theory, because all that we have to say on the relation of attack and defence, and on the completion of this double-sided act, concerns the state of crisis in which the forces are placed during the tension and motion, and because all the activity which can take place during the condition of equilibrium can only be regarded and treated as a corollary, for that crisis is the real war, and this state of equilibrium only its reflection. End of Book 3, Chapters 16 through 18. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia. Section 19 of On War. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. On War by Karl von Clausewitz. Translated by Colonel J. J. Graham. Book 4, Chapter 1. Introductory. Having in the foregoing book examined the subjects which may be regarded as the efficient elements of war, we shall now turn our attention to the combat as the real activity in warfare, which, by its physical and moral effects, embraces sometimes more simply, sometimes in a more complex manner, the object of the whole campaign. In this activity, and in its effects, these elements must therefore appear. The formation of the combat is tactical in its nature. We only glance at it here in a general way in order to get acquainted with its aspect as a whole. In practice, the minor or more immediate objects give every combat a characteristic form. These objects we shall not discuss until hereafter, but these peculiarities are, in comparison to the general characteristics of a combat, mostly only insignificant, so that most combats are very like one another, and therefore, in order to avoid repeating that which is general at every stage, we are compelled to look into it here before taking up the subject of its more special applications. In the first place, therefore, we shall give in the next chapter, in a few words, the characteristics of the modern battle in its tactical course. because that lies at the foundation of our conception of what the battle really is. Chapter 2. Character of the modern battle. According to the notion we have formed of tactics and strategies, it follows, as a matter of course, that if the nature of the former is changed, that change must have an influence on the latter. If tactical facts in one case are entirely different from those in another, then the strategic must be also, if they are to continue consistent and reasonable. It is therefore important to characterize a general action in its modern form before we advance with the study of its employment in strategy. What do we do now usually in a great battle? We place ourselves quietly in great masses, arranged contiguous to and behind one another. We deploy relatively only a small portion of the whole, and let it ring itself out in a fire combat which lasts for several hours, only interrupted now and again, and removed hither and thither, by separate small shocks from charges with the bayonet and cavalry attacks. When this line has gradually exhausted part of its warlike ardour in this manner, and there remains nothing more than the cinders, it is withdrawn and replaced by another. In this manner, the battle on a modified principle burns slowly away like wet powder, and if the veil of night commands it to stop, because neither party can any longer see, and neither chooses to run the risk of blind chance, then an account is taken by each side respectively of the masses remaining, which can be called still effective, that is, which are not yet quite collapsed like extinct volcanoes. Account is taken of the ground gained or lost, and of how stands the security of the rear. These results, with the special impressions as to bravery and cowardice, ability and stupidity, which are thought to have been observed in ourselves and in the enemy, are collected into one single total impression, out of which there springs the resolution to quit the field, or to renew the combat on the morrow. This description, which is not intended as a finished picture of a modern battle, but only to give its general tone, suits for the offensive and defensive, and the special traits which are given by the object proposed, the country, and such, may be introduced to it without materially altering the conception. But modern battles are not so by accident. They are so because the parties find themselves nearly on a level as regards military organization and the knowledge of the art of war, and because the warlike element inflamed by the general national interests has broken through the artificial limits and now flows in its natural channel. Under these two conditions, battles will always preserve this character. This general idea of the modern battle will be useful to us in sequel in more places than one. If we want to estimate the value of the particular coefficients of strength, country, and such. It is only for general, great, and decisive combats, and such as come near to them, that this description stands good. Inferior ones have changed their character also in the same direction, but less than great ones. The proof of this belongs to tactics. We shall, however, have an opportunity hereafter of making this subject plainer by giving a few particulars. Chapter 3. The combat in general. The combat is the real warlike activity. Everything else is only its auxiliary. Let us, therefore, take an attentive look at its nature. Combat means fighting, and in this the destruction or conquest of the enemy is the object, and the enemy, in the particular combat, is the armed force which stands opposed to us. This is the simple idea. We shall return to it, but before we can do that, we must insert a series of others. If we suppose the state and its military force as a unit, then the most natural idea is to imagine the war also as one great combat, and in the simple relations of savage nations, it is also not much otherwise. But our wars are made up of a number of great and small simultaneous or consecutive combats, and this severance of activity into so many separate actions is owing to the great multiplicity of the relations out of which war arises with us. In point of fact, the ultimate object of our wars, the political one, is not always quite a simple one, and even were it so, still the action is bound up with such a number of conditions and considerations to be taken into account that the object can no longer be attained by one single great act, but only through a number of greater or smaller acts which are bound up into a whole. Each of these separate acts is therefore a part of a whole, and has consequently a special object by which it is bound to this whole. We have already said that every strategic act can be referred to the idea of a combat, because it is an employment of the military force, and at the root of that there always lies the idea of fighting. We may therefore reduce every military activity in the province of strategy to the unit of the single combats, and occupy ourselves with the object of these only. We shall get acquainted with these special objects by degrees, as we come to speak of the causes which produce them. Here let us content ourselves with saying that every combat, great or small, has its own peculiar object in subordination to the main object. If this is the case, then, the destruction and conquest of the enemy is only to be regarded as the means of gaining this object, as it unquestionably is. But this result is true only in its form, and important only on account of the connection which the ideas have between themselves, and we have only sought it out to get rid of it at once. What is overcoming the enemy? Invariably the destruction of his military force, whether it be by death or wounds or any means, whether it be completely or only to such a degree that he can no longer continue the contest. Therefore, as long as we set aside all special objects of combats, we may look upon the complete or partial destruction of the enemy as the only object for all combats. Now we maintain that in the majority of cases, and especially in great battles, the special object by which the battle is individualized and bound up with the great whole is only a weak modification of that general object, or an ancillary object bound up with it, important enough to individualize the battle, but always insignificant in comparison with the general object, so that if that ancillary object alone should be obtained, only an unimportant part of the purpose of the combat is fulfilled. If this assertion is correct, then we see that the idea, according to which the destruction of the enemy's force is only the means, and something else always the object, can only be true in form, but that it would lead to false conclusions if we did not recollect that this destruction of the enemy's force is comprised in that object, and that this object is only a weak modification of it. Forgetfulness of this led to completely false views before the wars of the last period, and created tendencies, as well as fragments of systems, in which theory thought it raised itself so much the more above handcraft, the less it supposed itself to stand in need of the use of the real instrument, that is, the destruction of the enemy's force. Certainly such a system could not have arisen unless supported by other false suppositions, and unless in place of the destruction of the enemy, other things had been substituted to which an efficacy was ascribed which did not rightly belong to them. We shall attack these falsehoods whenever occasion requires, but we could not treat of the combat without claiming for it the real importance and value which belong to it, and giving warning against the errors to which merely formal truth might lead. But now how shall we manage to show that in most cases, and in those of most importance, the destruction of the enemy's army is the chief thing? How shall we manage to combat the extremely subtle idea which supposes it possible, through the use of a special artificial form, to effect by a small direct destruction of the enemy's forces a much greater destruction indirectly, or by means of small but extremely well-directed blows to produce such paralysis in the enemy's forces, such command over the enemy's will, that this mode of proceeding is to be viewed as a great shortening of the road. Undoubtedly, a victory at one point may be of more value than at another. Undoubtedly, there is a scientific arrangement of battles amongst themselves, even in strategy, which is in fact nothing but the art of thus arranging them. To deny that is not our intention, but we assert that the direct destruction of the enemy's forces is everywhere predominant. We contend here for the overruling importance of this destructive principle and nothing else. We must, however, call to mind that we are now engaged with strategy, not tactics. Therefore we do not speak of the means which the former have of destroying at a small expense a large body of the enemy's forces, but under direct destruction we understand the tactical results, and that, therefore, our assertion is that only great tactical results can lead to great strategical ones, or, as we have already once before more distinctly expressed it, the tactical successes are of paramount importance in the conduct of war. The proof of this assertion seems to us simple enough. It lies in the time which every complicated, artificial, combination requires. The question whether a simple attack, or one more carefully prepared, that is, more artificial, will produce greater effects, may undoubtedly be decided in favour of the latter, as long as the enemy is assumed to remain quite passive. But every carefully combined attack requires time for its preparation, and if a counterstroke by the enemy intervenes, our whole design may be upset. Now, if the enemy should decide upon some simple attack, which can be executed in a shorter time, then he gains the initiative and destroys the effect of the great plan. Therefore, together with the expediency of a complicated attack, we must consider all the dangers which we run during its preparation, and should only adopt it if there is no reason to fear that the enemy will disconcert our scheme. Whenever this is the case, we must ourselves choose the simpler, that is, quicker, way, and lower our views in this sense as far as the character, the relations of the enemy, and other circumstances may render necessary. If we quit the weak impressions of abstract ideas and descend to the region of practical life, then it is evident that a bold, courageous, resolute enemy will not let us have time for wide-reaching, skillful combinations, and it is just against such a one we should require skill the most. By this it appears to us that the advantage of simple and direct results over those that are complicated is conclusively shown. Our opinion is not, on that account, that the simple blow is the best, but that we must not lift the arm too far for the time given to strike, and that this condition will always lead more to direct conflict the more warlike our opponent is. Therefore, far from making it our aim to gain upon the enemy by complicated plans, we must rather seek to be beforehand with him by greater simplicity in our designs. If we seek for the lowest foundation stones of these converse propositions, we find that in the one it is ability, in the other courage. Now there is something very attractive in the notion that a moderate degree of courage, joined to great ability, will produce greater effects than a moderate ability with great courage. But unless we suppose these elements in a disproportionate relation, not logical, we have no right to assign to ability this advantage over courage in a field which is called danger, and which must be regarded as the true domain of courage. After this abstract view, we shall add only that experience, very far from leading to a different conclusion, is rather the sole cause which has impelled us in this direction and given rise to such reflections. Whoever reads history with a mind free from prejudice cannot fail to arrive at a conclusion that of all military virtues, energy in the conduct of operations has always contributed the most to the glory and success of arms. How we make good our principle of regarding the destruction of the enemy's force as the principal object, not only in the war as a whole, but also in each separate combat, and how that principle suits all the forms and conditions necessarily demanded by the relations out of which war springs, the sequel will show. For the present, all we desire is to uphold its general importance, and with this result we return again to the combat. Chapter 4. The Combat in General, Continuation. In the last chapter we showed the destruction of the enemy as the true object of the combat, and we have sought to prove by a special consideration of the point that this is true in the majority of cases and in respect to the most important battles, because the destruction of the enemy's army is always the preponderating object in war. The other objects which may be mixed up with this destruction of the enemy's force and may have more or less influence, we shall describe generally in the next chapter and become better acquainted with by degrees afterwards. Here we divest the combat of them entirely and look upon the destruction of the enemy as the complete and sufficient object of any combat. What are we now to understand by the destruction of the enemy's army? A diminution of it relatively greater than that of our own side. If we have a great superiority in numbers over the enemy, then naturally the same absolute amount of loss on both sides is for us a smaller one than for him, and consequently may be regarded in itself as an advantage. As we are here considering the combat as divested from all other objects, we must also exclude from our consideration the case in which the combat is used only indirectly for a greater destruction of the enemy's force. Consequently also, only that direct gain which has been made in the mutual process of destruction is to be regarded as the object, for this is an absolute gain which runs through the whole campaign, and at the end of it will always appear as pure profit, but every other kind of victory over our opponent will either have its motive in other objects, which we have completely excluded here, or it will only yield a temporary relative advantage. An example will make this plain. If by a skillful disposition we have reduced our opponent to such a dilemma that he cannot continue the combat without danger, and after some resistance he retires, then we may say that we have conquered him at that point. But if in this victory we have expended just as many forces as the enemy, then in closing the account of the campaign, there is no gain remaining from this victory, if such a result can be called a victory. Therefore, the overcoming the enemy, that is, placing him in such a position that he must give up the fight, counts for nothing in itself, and for that reason cannot come under the definition of object. There remains, therefore, as we have said, nothing over except the direct gain which we have made in the process of destruction. But to this belong not only the losses which have taken place in the course of the combat, but also those which, after the withdrawal of the conquered part, take place as direct consequences of the same. Now it is known by experience that the losses in physical forces in the course of a battle seldom present a great difference between victor and vanquished respectively, often none at all, sometimes even one bearing an inverse relation to the result, and that the most decisive losses on the side of the vanquished only commence with the retreat, that is, those which the conqueror does not share with him. The weak remains of battalions already in disorder are cut down by cavalry. Exhausted men strew the ground, disabled guns and broken caissons are abandoned. Others, in the bad state of the roads, cannot be removed quickly enough, and are captured by the enemy's troops. During the night numbers lose their way and fall defenceless into the enemy's hands, and thus the victory mostly gains bodily substance after it is already decided. Here would be a paradox if it did not solve itself in the following manner. The loss in physical force is not the only one which the two sides suffer in the course of the combat. The moral forces are also shaken, broken, and go to ruin. It is not only the loss in men, horses, and guns, but in order, courage, confidence, cohesion, and plan, which come into consideration when it is a question whether the fight can still be continued or not. It is principally the moral forces which decide here, and in all cases in which the conqueror has lost as heavily as the conquered, it is these alone. The comparative relation of the physical losses is difficult to estimate in a battle, but not so the relation of the moral ones. Two things principally make it known. The first is the loss of the ground on which the fight has taken place. The other, the superiority of the enemies. The more our reserves have diminished, as compared with those of the enemy, the more force we have used to maintain the equilibrium. In this at once, an evident proof of the moral superiority of the enemy is given, which seldom fails to stir up in the soul of the commander a certain bitterness of feeling, and a sort of contempt for his own troops. But the principal thing is, that men who have been engaged for a long continuance of time are more or less like burnt-out cinders. Their ammunition is consumed, they have melted away to a certain extent, physical and moral energies are exhausted, perhaps their courage is broken as well. Such a force, irrespective of the diminution in its number, if viewed as an organic whole, is very different from what it was before the combat, and thus it is that the loss of moral force may be measured by the reserves which have been used as if it were on a foot rule. Lost ground and want of fresh reserves are, therefore, usually the principal causes which determine a retreat, but at the same time we by no means exclude or desire to throw into the shade other reasons which may lie in the interdependence of the parts of the army, in the general plan, and such. Every combat is therefore the bloody and destructive measuring of the strength of forces, physical and moral. Whoever at the close has the greatest amount of both left is the conqueror. In the combat, the loss of moral force is the chief cause of the decision. After that is given, this loss continues to increase until it reaches its culminating point at the close of the whole act. This then is the opportunity the victor should seize to reap his harvest by the utmost possible restrictions of his enemy's forces, the real object of engaging in the combat. On the beaten side, the loss of all order and control often makes the prolongation of resistance by individual units, by the further punishment they are certain to suffer, more injurious than useful to the whole. The spirit of the mass is broken, the original excitement about losing or winning, through which danger was forgotten, is spent, and to the majority, danger now appears no longer an appeal to their courage, but rather the endurance of a cruel punishment. Thus the instrument in the first moment of the enemy's victory is weakened and blunted, and therefore no longer fit to repay danger by danger. This period, however, passes. The moral forces of the conquered will recover by degrees, order will be restored, courage will revive, and in the majority of cases there remains only a small part of the superiority obtained, often none at all. In some cases even, although rarely, the spirit of revenge and intensified hostility may bring about an opposite result. On the other hand, whatever is gained in killed, wounded, prisoners, and guns captured can never disappear from the account. The losses in a battle consist more in killed and wounded, those after the battle more in artillery taken and prisoners. The first the conqueror shares with the conquered, more or less, but the second not, and for that reason they usually only take place on one side of the conflict, at least they are considerably in excess on one side. Artillery and prisoners are therefore at all times regarded as the true trophies of victory, as well as its measure, because through these things its extent is declared beyond a doubt. Even the degree of moral superiority may be better judged by them than by any other relation, especially if the number of killed and wounded is compared therewith, and here arises a new power increasing the moral effects. We have said that the moral forces, beaten to the ground in the battle and in the immediately succeeding movements, recover themselves gradually and often bear no traces of injury. This is the case with small divisions of the whole, less frequently with large divisions. It may, however, also be the case with the main army, but seldom or never in the state or government to which the army belongs. These estimate the situation more impartially, and from a more elevated point of view, and recognize in the number of trophies taken by the enemy, and their relation to the number of killed and wounded, only too easily and well the measure of their own weakness and inefficiency. In point of fact, the lost balance of moral power must not be treated lightly, because it has no absolute value, and because it does not of necessity appear in all cases in the amounts of the results at the final close. It may become of such excessive weight as to bring down everything with an irresistible force. On that account, it may often become a great aim of the operation, of which we shall speak elsewhere. Here we have still to examine some of its fundamental relations. The moral effect of a victory increases not merely in proportion to the extent of the forces engaged, but in a progressive ratio, that is to say, not only in extent, but also in its intensity. In a beaten detachment, order is easily restored. As a single frozen limb is easily revived by the rest of the body, so the courage of a defeated detachment is easily raised again by the courage of the rest of the army as soon as it rejoins it. If, therefore, the effects of a small victory are not completely done away with, still they are partly lost to the enemy. This is not the case if the army itself sustains a great defeat. Then one with the other fall together. A great fire attains quite a different heat from several small ones. Another relation which determines the moral value of a victory is the numerical relation of the forces which have been in conflict with each other. To beat many with few is not only a double success, but shows also a greater, especially a more general, superiority, which the conquered must always be fearful of encountering again. At the same time, this influence is in reality hardly observable in such a case. In the moment of real action, the notions of the actual strength of the enemy are generally so uncertain, the estimate of our own commonly so incorrect, that the party superior in numbers either does not admit the disproportion, or is very far from admitting the full truth, owing to which he evades almost entirely the moral disadvantages which would spring from it. It is only hereafter in history that the truth, long suppressed through ignorance, vanity, or a wise discretion, makes its appearance, and then it certainly casts a lustre on the army and its leader, but it can then do nothing more by its moral influence for events long past. If prisoners and captured guns are those things by which the victory principally gains substance, its true crystallizations, then the plan of the battle should have those things specially in view. The destruction of the enemy by death and wounds appears here merely as a means to an end. How far this may influence the dispositions in battle is not an affair of strategy, but the decision to fight the battle is in intimate connection with it, as is shown by the direction given to our forces and their general grouping, whether we threaten the enemy's flank or rear, or he threatens ours. On this point, the number of prisoners and captured guns depends very much, and it is a point which, in many cases, tactics alone cannot satisfy, particularly if the strategic relations are too much in opposition to it. The risk of having to fight on two sides, and the still more dangerous position of having no line of retreat left open, paralyze the movements and the power of resistance. Further, in case of defeat, they increase the loss, often raising it to its extreme point, that is, to destruction. Therefore, the rear being endangered makes defeat more probable, and at the same time, more decisive. From this arises, in the whole conduct of the war, especially in great and small combats, a perfect instinct to secure our own line of retreat and to seize that of the enemy. This follows from the conception of victory, which, as we have seen, is something beyond mere slaughter. In this effort we see, therefore, the first immediate purpose in the combat, and one which is quite universal. No combat is imaginable in which this effort, either in its double or single form, does not go hand in hand with the plain and simple stroke of force. Even the smallest troop will not throw itself upon its enemy without thinking of its line of retreat, and, in most cases, it will have an eye upon that of the enemy also. We should have to digress to show how often this instinct is prevented from going the direct road, how often it must yield to the difficulties arising from more important considerations. We shall, therefore, rest contented with affirming it to be a general natural law of the combat. It is, therefore, active, presses everywhere with its natural weight, and so becomes the pivot on which almost all tactical and strategic maneuvers turn. If we now take a look at the conception of victory as a whole, we find in it three elements. 1. The greater loss of the enemy in physical power. 2. In moral power. 3. His open avowal of this by the relinquishment of his intentions. The returns made up on each side of losses in killed and wounded are never exact, seldom truthful, and in most cases full of intentional misrepresentations. Even the statement of the number of trophies is seldom to be quite depended on. Consequently, when it is not considerable, it may also cast a doubt even on the reality of the victory. Of the loss in moral forces there is no reliable measure except in the trophies. Therefore, in many cases, the giving up the contest is the only real evidence of the victory. It is, therefore, to be regarded as a confession of inferiority, as the lowering of the flag, by which, in this particular instance, right and superiority are conceded to the enemy, and this degree of humiliation and disgrace, which, however, must be distinguished from all other moral consequences of the loss of equilibrium, is an essential part of the victory. It is this part alone which acts upon the public opinion outside the army, upon the people and the government in both belligerent states, and upon all others in any way concerned. But renouncement of the general object is not quite identical with quitting the field of battle. Even when the battle has been very obstinate and long kept up, no one says of advanced posts, when they retire after an obstinate combat, that they have given up their object. Even in combats aimed at the destruction of the enemy's army, the retreat from the battlefield is not always to to be regarded as a relinquishment of this aim, as for instance in retreats planned beforehand, in which the ground is disputed foot by foot. All this belongs to that part of our subject where we shall speak of the separate object of the combat. Here we only wish to draw attention to the fact that in most cases the giving up of the object is very difficult to distinguish from the retirement from the battlefield, and that the impression produced by the latter, both in and out of the army, is not to be treated lightly. For generals and armies whose reputation is not made, this is, in itself, one of the difficulties in many operations, justified by circumstances when a succession of combats, each ending in retreat, may appear as a succession of defeats, without being so in reality, and when that appearance may exercise a very depressing influence. It is impossible for the retreating general, by making known his real intentions, to prevent the moral effect spreading to the public and his troops, for to do that with effect he must disclose his plans completely, which, of course, would run counter to his principal interests to too great a degree. In order to draw attention to the special importance of this conception of victory, we shall only refer to the Battle of Soor, the trophies from which were not important, a few thousand prisoners and 20 guns, and where Frederick proclaimed his victory by remaining for 5 days after on the field of battle, although his retreat into Silesia had been previously determined on, and was a measure natural to his whole situation. According to his own account, he thought he would hasten a peace by the moral effect of his victory. Now, although a couple of other successes were likewise required, namely the Battle of Katholisch-Herensdorf in Lusitania, and the Battle of Kesseldorf, before this peace took place, still we cannot say that the moral effect of the Battle of Soor was nil. If it is chiefly the moral force which is shaken by defeat, and if the number of trophies reaped up by the enemy mounts up to an unusual height, then the lost combat becomes a rout. But this is not the necessary consequence of every victory. A rout only sets in when the moral force of the defeated is very severely shaken. Then there often ensues a complete incapability of further resistance, and the whole action consists of giving way, that is, of flight. Jena and Belle Alliance were routs, but not so Borodino. Although without pedantry we can give here no single line of separation, because the difference between the things is one of degrees, yet still the retention of the conception is essential as a central point to give clearness to our theoretical ideas, and it is a want in our terminology that for a victory over the enemy tantamount to a rout, and a conquest of the enemy only tantamount to a simple victory, there is only one and the same word to use. Chapter 5, on the signification of the combat. Having in the preceding chapter examined the combat in its absolute form, as the miniature picture of the whole war, we now turn to the relations which it bears to the other parts of the great whole. First we inquire, what is more precisely the signification of a combat? As war is nothing else but a mutual process of destruction, then the most natural answer in conception, and perhaps also in reality, appears to be that all the powers of each party unite in one great volume, and all results in one great shock of these masses. There is certainly much truth in this idea, and it seems to me very advisable that we should adhere to it, and should on that account look upon small combats at first only as necessary loss, like the shavings from a carpenter's plane. Still, however, the thing cannot be settled so easily. That a multiplication of combat should arise from a fractioning of forces is a matter of course, and the more immediate objects of separate combats will therefore come before us in the subject of a fractioning of forces. But these objects, and together with them the whole mass of combats, may in a general way be brought under certain classes, and the knowledge of these classes will contribute to make our observations more intelligible. Destruction of the enemy's military forces is in reality the object of all combats, but other objects may be joined thereto, and these other objects may be at the same time predominant. We must therefore draw a distinction between those in which the destruction of the enemy's forces is the principal object, and those in which it is more the means. The destruction of the enemy's force, the possession of a place or the possession of some object, may be the general motive for a combat, and it may be either one of these alone or several together, in which case, however, usually one is the principal motive. Now, the two principal forms of war, the offensive and defensive, of which we shall shortly speak, do not modify the first of these motives, but they certainly do modify the other two, and therefore, if we arrange them in a scheme, they would appear thus: offensive, 1. Destruction of the enemy's force, 2. Conquest of a place, 3. Conquest of some object. Defensive, 1. Destruction of enemy's force, 2. Defense of a place, 3. Quicker than if there is artillery as well. In hills and forests, we cannot advance as quickly as on a level country. All this is clear enough. From this it follows, therefore, that strength, relation of the three arms, and position must be considered if the combat is to fulfill an object by its duration. But to set up this rule was of less importance to us in our present considerations than to connect with it at once the chief results which experience gives us on the subject. Even the resistance of an ordinary division of 8,000 to 10,000 men of all arms, opposed to an enemy considerably superior in numbers, will last several hours, if the advantages of country are not too preponderating, and if the enemy is only a little, or not at all, superior in numbers. The combat will last half a day. A corps of 3 or 4 divisions will prolong it to double the time, an army of 80,000 or 100,000 to 3 or 4 times. Therefore the masses may be left to themselves for that length of time, and no separate combat takes place if within that time other forces can be brought up, whose cooperation mingles them at once into one stream with the results of the combat which has taken place. These calculations are the results of experience, but it is important for us at the same time to characterize more particularly the moment of the decision, and consequently the termination. End of Book 4, Chapter 6. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia. Section 20 of On War. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. On War by Karl von Clausewitz. Translated by Colonel J. J. Graham. Book 4, Chapter 7. Decision of the Combat. No battle is decided in a single moment, although in every battle there arise moments of crisis, on which the result depends. The loss of a battle is, therefore, a gradual falling off the scale, but there is in every combat a point of time when it may be regarded as decided, in such a way that the renewal of the fight would be a new battle, not a continuation of the old one. To have a clear notion on this point of time, is very important in order to be able to decide whether, with the prompt assistance of reinforcements, the combat can again be resumed with advantage. Often in combats which are beyond restoration, new forces are sacrificed in vain. Often through neglect, the decision has not been seized when it might easily have been secured. Here are two examples which could not be more to the point. When the Prince of Hohenlohe in 1806 at Jena, with 35,000 men, opposed to from 60,000 to 70,000 under Bonaparte, had accepted battle and lost it, but lost it in such a way that the 35,000 may be regarded as dissolved, General Ruschel undertook to renew the fight with about 12,000. The consequence was that, in a moment, his force was scattered in like manner. On the other hand, on the same day at Auerstadt, the Prussians maintained a combat with 25,000 against Davoust, who had 28,000, until midday, without success it is true, but still without the force being reduced to a state of dissolution, without even greater loss than the enemy, who was very deficient in cavalry. But they neglected to use the reserve of 18,000, under General Kalkreuth, to restore the battle which, under these circumstances, it would have been impossible to lose. Each combat is a whole in which the partial combats combine themselves into one total result. In this total result lies the decision of the combat. This success need not be exactly a victory such as we have denoted in the 6th chapter, for often the preparations for that have not been made. Often there is no opportunity if the enemy gives way too soon, and in most cases the decision, even when the resistance has been obstinate, takes place before such a degree of success is attained as would completely satisfy the idea of victory. We therefore ask, which is commonly the moment of the decision? That is to say, the moment when a fresh, effective, of course not disproportionate, force can no longer turn a disadvantageous battle. If we pass over false attacks, which in accordance with their nature are properly without decision, then 1. If the possession of a movable object was the object of the combat, the loss of the same is always the decision. 2. If the possession of ground was the object of the combat, then the decision generally lies in its loss. Still not always. Only if this ground is of peculiar strength, ground which is easy to pass over, however important it may be in other respects, cannot be retaken without much danger. 3. But in all cases where these two circumstances have not already decided the combat, therefore, particularly in case the destruction of the enemy's force is the principal object, the decision is reached at the moment when the conqueror ceases to feel himself in a state of disintegration, that is, of unserviceableness to a certain extent. When, therefore, there is no advantage in using the successive efforts spoken of in the 12th chapter of the 3rd book. On this ground, we have given the strategic unity of the battle its place here. A battle, therefore, in which the assailant has not lost his condition of order and perfect efficiency at all, or at least only in a small part of his force, whilst the opposing forces are more or less disorganized throughout, is only not to be retrieved, and just as little if the enemy has recovered his inefficiency. The smaller, therefore, that part of a force is which has really been engaged, the greater that portion which, as a reserve, has contributed to the result only by its presence. So much the less will any new force of the enemy wrest again the victory from our hands, and that commander who carries out to the furthest with his army the principle of conducting the combat with the greatest economy of forces, and making the most of the moral effect of strong reserves, goes the surest way to victory. We must allow that the French, in modern times, especially when led by Bonaparte, have shown a thorough mastery in this. Further, the moment when the crisis stage of the combat ceases with the conqueror, and his original state of order is restored, takes place sooner the smaller the unit he controls. A picket of cavalry pursuing an enemy...
አድማጮቻችን የዚህ ሴግመንት ማለት የካርል ቫን ኦን ዋር ቮሊዩም 1 ቡክ 4 ኮንቲኒዩሽን በሚቀጥለው ሴግመንት ታገኙታላችሁ ማለት ነው።